Captain Carlson gives the following list of articles found in the lone hut on the shore of Novia Zemlya. Iron frame over the fireplace with shifting bar, 2 ship cooking pans of copper found standing on the iron frame with the remains of a copper scoop. Copper bands, probably at one time fastened round pails. Bar of iron, iron crowbar, 1 long and 2 small gun barrels, 2 bores or augers, each 3 feet in length, chisel, padlock, caulking iron, 3 gouges and 6 files. Plate of zinc, earthenware jar, tankard with zinc lid. Lower half of another tankard, 6 fragments of pepper pots, tin meat strainer, pair of boots, sword, fragments of old engravings with Latin couplets underneath them, 3 Dutch books, a small piece of metal, 19 cartridge cases, some still full of powder, iron chest with lid and intricate lockwork, fragments of metal handle of same, grindstone, an 8-pound iron weight, small cannonball, gun lock with hammer and flint, clock, bell of clock and striker, rasp, small auger, small narrow strips of copper band, 2 salt and pepper pots about 8 inches high, 2 pairs of compasses, fragment of iron-handled knife, 3 spoons, borer, hone, 1 wooden and 1 bronze tap, 2 wooden stoppers for gun muzzles, 2 spear or ice bowl heads, 4 navigation instruments, a flute, lock and key, another lock, sledgehammer head, clock weight, 26 pewter, candlesticks and fragments, 6 in a complete state of preservation. Pitcher of Etruscan shape, beautifully engraved, upper half of another pitcher, wooden trencher colored red, clock alarum, 3 scales, 4 medallions, circular about 8 inches in diameter, 3 of them mounted in oak frames, a string of buttons, hilt of sword and a foot of its blade, halberd head, and 2 carved pieces of wood, 1 with the haft of a knife in it. On the 14th of September, Captain Carlson sailed from the ice haven and kept along the east coast of Novia Zemlya, encountering bad weather and contrary winds, but succeeding in his chief object, the circumnavigation of the island, which he accomplished on the 6th of October. He returned to Hammerfest early in November. Our chronological summary now brings us to the Austrian polar expedition of 1872. The command was entrusted to Lieutenant Payer, an accomplished seaman who had served under Captain Coldwey. Carlson was engaged as pilot, and the steamer Tegethoff was carefully and abundantly equipped for the voyage. The plan laid down by Lieutenant Payer was well conceived, namely, to round the northeastern point of Novia Zemlya and sail eastward until he 271 made the extreme north of Siberia, where he proposed to winter. In the spring, traveling parties would be sent out on exploring journeys, and the voyage in summer would be continued as far as Bering Strait. The Tegethoff steamed out of Tromsø harbor on the 13th of July, first fell in with the ice on the 25th, in lat. 7415 N, and on the 29th sighted the coast of Novia Zemlya. Here she was caught in the pack, but steam being got up, repeated charges were made at the enemy, and she was carried bravely into an open waterway about 20 miles wide to the north of the Matotchkia Strait. On the 12th of August she was joined by the Isbjorn yacht, with Count Wilczek and some friends on board. The 2 vessels anchored close to the shore in lat. 7630 N, and on the 18th celebrated the Emperor of Austria's birthday. Daily excursions were made by sledge parties to the adjoining islands, resulting in an accumulation of botanical and geological specimens, besides slaughtered bears and foxes, and quantities of driftwood. On the 23rd the vessels parted company, the Tegethoff steaming to the northward, and the Isbjorn endeavoring to push southward along the coast. On reaching the mouth of the Petchora, Count Wilczek and his friends left her to proceed on the return voyage to Tromsø, while they ascended the Petchora in small boats to Perm, and returned to Vienna by way of Moscow. The Tegethoff spent the winters of 1872 and 1873 in the icy sea, and made some discoveries of interest. It returned in safety in the summer of 1874. In 1871, an American expedition was fitted out under the command of Captain Charles Francis Hall, who had already gained distinction by his explorations in the polar regions and his long residence among the Eskimos. Through the liberality of Mr. Grinnell, assisted by the United States government, he was provided with a stout and well-found steamer, the Polaris, which sailed from Brooklyn on the 29th of June. She carried a crew of 17 officers and men, Mr. Buddington being sailing and ice master, and Mr. Tyson assistant navigator, besides 6 adult Eskimos and 2 children, and a scientific staff consisting of Dr. Emil Bessel, Mr. Bryan, and Mr. Frederick Mayers. A few days previous to the sailing of the expedition, Mr. Grinnell presented Hall with the historic flag which Lieutenant Wilkes, in 1838, had borne nearer to the South Pole than any American flag had been before, which Lieutenant de Haven, and afterwards Dr. Kane, and lastly Dr. Hayes, had carried further north than any other ensign. Captain Hall, in receiving it, expressed his conviction that, in the spring of 1872, it would float over a new world, in which the North Pole Star is the crowning jewel. On the 3rd of July, the Polaris entered the landlocked harbor of St. John's, Newfoundland, where she remained a week while her machinery underwent some repairs. Then she proceeded north to Hallsteinberg in Greenland, but failed in procuring a supply of coal or a stock of reindeer furs, both of which were much desiderated. On the 4th of August, she arrived at the Danish settlement of Godhaven, and happily found the United States Steamer Congress, which had been dispatched with extra stores and supplies. Thence she steamed northward to Upernavik, which was reached on the 18th. So far her progress seemed to have been peculiarly fortunate, but already dissensions had broken out among the officers, which augured ill for the eventual success of the expedition. In his dispatches home, however, Captain Hall made no allusion to this discouraging circumstance, and his biographer explains this silence by his 272 idiosyncrasy, which enabled him to sink everything else in the one idea of pushing on to the far north. Upernavik, with its little colony of Danish officials and Eskimo natives, was left behind on the 21st of August, and the Polaris continued her adventurous course. 6 days later, she arrived at Kane's winter quarters in 1853-55, and at the point where he abandoned his little vessel, the Advance. Next day her crew found a huge wall of ice in front of them, and doubled round it by steering to the west-northwest. Then again putting their vessel's head to the northward, they made their way up Kennedy Channel, and gained the threshold of what Dr. Kane had supposed to be the open polar sea. They discovered, however, that it was bounded by land on either side, with a vast expanse of ice stretching far beyond it. Careful observation showed that it was, in reality, a bay, which Kane had mistaken for the open sea when its land boundaries were hidden by fog. It is about 45 miles wide. Thence they entered a channel similar to that of Kennedy, which measured about 17 miles in breadth, and was obstructed by heavy ice. Their progress now was slow and difficult, and many of the crew wore rueful countenances, as if they were going to sail off the edge of the world. A more serious obstacle was the timidity of Captain Buddington, who showed himself opposed to pushing further northward. Hall, therefore, resolved to carry the steamer inshore, land some of his stores, and prepare for wintering at this advanced point of Ultima Thule. At midnight, on the 4th of September, Captain Hall raised an American flag on this land, the northernmost site on which any civilized flag had been planted. When it was waving in the breeze, he proclaimed that he took possession of the surrounding region of snow and ice, in the name of the Lord, and for the President of the United States. He then returned on board the Polaris, and her anchor was let go. The place was only a bend in the coast, and afforded no protection as a harbor. They therefore steamed through the open water and searched further to the southward, but finding no more sheltered quarters, they returned to their former anchorage and began to land provisions, the wind moaning sadly and the snow falling in heavy showers. On the 7th, they weighed anchor and steamed in nearer to the shore, bringing the ship round behind an iceberg, which lay aground in 13 fathoms of water. This huge mass of ice proved to be about 450 feet in length, 300 feet in breadth, and 60 feet in height, lat. 8138 n long. 6145 W. The berg was named Providence Berg, and the cove in which they had established themselves, Thank God Harbor. On surveying the surrounding country, they found nothing calculated to brighten the prospects of the coming winter. The coast hills rose from 9 to 1,300 feet in height, and were furrowed and scarred with great cracks and fissures, which bore witness to the rough usage of frost and ice, wind and weather. To the south lay a large glacier, which swept round in a wide circuit, and fell into the bay immediately north of their anchorage. Traces of Eskimos were discernible here and there, circles of stones, indicating where they had pitched their tents. The landscape was all of a dull neutral tint, a kind of cold gray, for as yet the winter snow had not clothed it with its mantle of dazzling whiteness. For this, however, the adventurers had not long to wait. A snowstorm began on the 27th of September and lasted for 36 hours. Funeral of Captain Hall. On the 10th of October, Captain Hall organized a sledging expedition, as a preliminary to an extended journey in the spring. There were 2 sledges, each drawn by 7 dogs, Captain 275 Hall and Eskimo Joe in one sledge, and Mr. Chester and Eskimo Hans in the other. They were absent until the 24th, but owing to the roughness of the ice had accomplished only 50 miles and had made no discovery. Meantime, the crew had been engaged in banking up the ice around the ship in order to protect it from collision with drifting floes. The deck was partly roofed over and covered with canvas, and other preparations were made to resist the terrible inclemency of an Arctic winter. These, however, were temporarily suspended by the sudden illness of Captain Hall. On the 1st of November he was a little better, but on the 3rd his malady, which appears to have been a form of paralysis, took a turn for the worse, and the end came so rapidly that the eager-hearted, enthusiastic explorer, who had braved so many harsh experiences in the polar world, fell asleep early on the morning of the 8th. A grave was immediately prepared for the reception of his remains about half a mile inland, a shallow grave, for the ground was frozen so hard that it was scarcely possible to break it up, even with picks, and on the 11th the funeral took place. The time chosen was 11:30 in the morning, yet it was so dark that Mr. Bryan read prayers by the light of a lantern dimly burning. All the ship's company were present. The coffin was hauled on a sledge, over which, by way of pall, was spread the American flag with its stars and stripes. The captain and officers, Dr. Bessel and Mr. Mayers, followed as mourners, and strange and picturesque must the melancholy procession have appeared, as it wound its way through ice and snow, while a weird boreal light or gleam in the air revealed the outlines of the distant hills, rising like a rampart on the edge of the snow-covered plain, and flickered every now and then over the frozen expanse of the icebound bay. Thus, says Captain Tyson, thus ended poor Hall's ambitious projects, thus was stilled the effervescing enthusiasm of his ardent nature. Wise he might not always have been, but his soul was in his work, and had he lived till spring, I think he would have gone as far as mortal man could go to accomplish his mission. But with his death, I fear that all hopes of further progress will have to be abandoned. That Tyson was right in his conjecture, our narrative will show. Captain Buddington succeeded to the command, and one of his first measures was to discontinue the Sunday service, for reasons which he does not seem to have explained, and we are unable to imagine. So far as we can gather from the published records of the expedition, he was a man unfitted to bear responsibility, a man without enthusiasm in himself, and incapable, therefore, of stimulating it in others. Nor could he secure the obedience of his inferiors. Seamen are always prompt to detect the weakness of their officers, and the crew of the Polaris soon assured themselves that their new captain was deficient both in courage and resolution. However, the winter gradually closed in upon the little ice-bound company of the Polaris, and they were called upon to endure, with such patience as was at their command, the severities of the long Arctic night. It was very dark, yet not totally dark. For an hour or two at noon, it was possible to wander a short distance from the snow-roofed vessel. But once away from it, the gloom and silence of everything around settled down on the wanderer like a pall. There were none of the usual sounds of nature to relieve the deep oppression of the scene. The other evening, says Tyson, I had wandered away from the ship, disgusted with the confusion and noise, and longing for a moment's quiet. Once beyond range of the men's voices, there was 276 absolutely no other sound whatever. It was quite calm, no wind, no movement of any living creature, nothing but a leaden sky above, ice beneath my feet, and silence everywhere. It hung like a pall over everything. So painfully oppressive did it become at last that I was frequently tempted to shout aloud to break the spell. At last I did, but no response came, not even an echo. The space was void, there I stood. And the sole specter was the solitude. An Arctic snowstorm. On the 1st of January 1872, it is recorded that 80 days had elapsed since the adventurers had seen the sun. The internal economy of the Polaris, meantime, was pitiably disorganized. There was no discipline, no order, no method. The men did what they pleased, and consequently made night hideous by their prolonged carousals. The officers disagreed among themselves, and the object of the expedition appeared to have been lost sight of, or no longer to excite any deep or permanent interest. It was even discussed as a proper and probable course to abandon the proposed northward exploration, and as soon as the ice broke up, to make all haste back to New York. Early in February, the daylight began to gain upon the night a little, and the Eskimos hunted for seals, as they could be heard under the ice making their breathing holes. Storms were very frequent, storms which drove the snow afar in dense, blinding clouds, and false moons and other atmospheric phenomena attracted the attention of the curious observer. On 277 the 28th, after an absence of 135 days, the sun reappeared, and never was royal guest more eagerly welcomed by a loyal people. Its rays seemed to bring with them a promise of new life. Men's hearts grew lighter in spite of themselves, and all felt as if they had been relieved from a heavy and intolerable burden. Not that the temperature showed any perceptible difference. The thermometer indicated 37 below zero on the 1st of March. Passing over a couple of months, which present no incidents of importance, we find that on the 9th of May, the monotonous dullness of the expedition was broken by a sledge journey to the north, undertaken by Captain Tyson, with Mayers, Joe, and Hans as companions. They were absent from the ship 6 days, striking inland in an east-northeast direction to Newman Bay and thence keeping more to the north until they reached lat. 82.9. Mr. Mayer surveyed the shores of Newman Bay, and Captain Tyson endeavored to secure some game. One day they came on a large herd of muskoxen. These animals act very curiously when an attack is made upon them. They form a circle, stern to stern, and await the assault of their enemies. The dogs surround them and keep them at bay. Not unfrequently a dog gets tossed. Though Joe and the captain fired and reloaded as fast as they could, the poor brutes offered no resistance, but when 8 had fallen, the remainder took to flight. The slaughtered oxen were then flayed, and the best pieces cut up for conveyance to the ship. These cattle developed their great size and weight on what might be supposed to form a very slender diet. Their food is the mosses and lichens which grow on the rocks, and to obtain it, they must first scrape away the snow with their hoofs. At the first sign of danger, the calves shelter themselves under their parents' body, and their hair is so long as to afford the young a very complete and satisfactory screen. The muskox is an animal of considerable bulk. Several of those shot by Tyson and the Eskimos weighed from 500 to 600 pounds. Each. In proportion to their size and weight, their legs are very short. Early in June, Captain Buddington resolved to dispatch a couple of boats, for the purpose of exploring the neighboring coast and discovering, if possible, an open water channel to the north. One of these was placed under the command of Mr. Chester, the other of Captain Tyson. Mr. Chester's boat was nipped in an ice floe and crushed to pieces. The crew escaped with difficulty, but the historical flag was lost. Captain Tyson pushed forward to Newman Bay, where some eiderducks, gulls, and dovekies were shot. Joined by Mr. Chester, who had returned to the ship and secured the safety boat, he found his further progress arrested by that compact, insuperable field of ice which is the despair of Arctic navigators. All attempts to get further to the north proved in vain, and orders to return having arrived from Captain Buddington, there was nothing to be done but to rejoin the Polaris. The summer passed away, and still the Polaris lay beset among the ice, or rather, drifted slowly to the southward, along with the floe to which it was attached. No sledge expeditions were organized, and Captain Buddington's sole concern was to watch for an opportunity of getting out into the open channel and returning to New York. Some slight progress southward was occasionally made, but towards the end of October, it became evident that the explorers would have to spend a second winter in their frozen captivity. They had been carried beyond Rensselaer Harbor, where Dr. Kane wintered during 1853-55 and began the construction of a storehouse for provisions, in case the ship should be endangered by the drifting ice. This dreaded catastrophe did indeed occur on the night of the 15th. The pressure of the 278 floe was tremendous, but the Polaris bore it bravely, though groaning and creaking in every timber. After a while, however, it was found that she had started a leak aft and that the water was gaining on the pumps. The discovery seems to have startled Buddington out of all coolness or reflection. He threw up his arms and cried out to throw everything on the ice. Immediately all was chaos. The men seized whatever lay near to their hands and threw it overboard. A quantity of stores had been previously placed on the deck in anticipation of such an event, but these were now hurled on the floe in indiscriminate confusion and with considerable loss. Captain Tyson and some of the men got overboard, with the view of arranging things in, at least, a semblance of order. But while he was thus engaged, the ice commenced cracking. Shortly afterwards it exploded under his feet and broke in many places. The ship drove away in the darkness, and Tyson and his companions immediately lost sight of her. It was a terrible night. The wind blew a hurricane, and the snow fell heavily in drifting, whirling masses. We did not know, says Tyson, who was on the ice or who was on the ship. But seeing some muskox skins lying across a wide crack in the ice, he pulled them towards him to save them, and behold, rolled up in one of them were 2 or 3 of the children of Hans the Eskimo. Some of the men were afloat on small pieces of ice, but by means of the whaleboat these were rescued. And when the gray light of morning dawned on the scene, Tyson ascertained that 18 persons besides himself were castaways. These were Mr. Mayers, meteorologist, Heron, steward, Jackson, cook, 6 seamen, Joe and Hans, the Eskimos, and their wives and children. The piece of the floe on which they were cast was nearly circular and about 4 miles in circumference. It was not level, but full of hillocks and of ponds or small lakes, which had been formed by the melting of the ice during the short summer. The ice varied greatly in thickness. Some of the mounds or hills were probably 30 feet thick, the flat parts not more than 10 or 15. The surface was exceedingly rugged, and the hummocks were white with snow. Tyson's first task was to inspect the stock of provisions that had been collected on the floe. It consisted of 14 cans of pemmican, 11.5 bags of bread, 1 can of dried apples, and 14 hams, and if the ship did not return for them, they might have to support themselves upon this supply all through the dreary winter, or die of starvation. Fortunately, they had a couple of boats, and Tyson's second care was to load these, embark his little company, and endeavor to reach the shore. In this attempt they were balked by the drifting ice, and before they could repeat it, they caught sight of the Polaris. Immediately they ran up a rough and ready signal, but no one seemed to be keeping a lookout, and the castaways had the mortification of seeing her drop away behind Littleton Island without undertaking any search for her missing crew. Tyson therefore resolved to cross to the other side of the floe and make for the land, perhaps lower down than the Polaris was, so as to intercept her. Everything was thrown away, except 2 or 3 days' provisions, and the boats were got ready. But the men were slow and reluctant. Oars were wanting, a violent gale arose, and as night was coming on, Tyson found himself compelled to abandon his intention. On the following day, the ice again broke, and now the adventurers were drifting with 1 boat on 1 piece of ice, while the other 281 boat, a part of their provisions, and an extemporized hut of poles, remained on the main part of the original floe. The ice raft which carried Tyson and his companions measured about 150 yards each way. The castaways on the ice. Adrift on the ice floe. On the 21st, however, the boat and provisions were recovered. Joe, with the keen eye of an Eskimo, caught sight of the bow of the boat, projecting from a fragment of the broken ice. Followed by his faithful ally, Tyson went in search of it, leaping like a chamois hunter from crag to crag. 6 of the dogs had accompanied him. These were harnessed to the boat, and with the help of sturdy arms dragged it over the disrupted floe. The whole party then removed to the large floe, where some snow houses were speedily erected. They formed quite an encampment, 1 hut, or rather a sort of half-hut, for Mr. Mayers and Captain Tyson, Joe's hut for himself, his wife, and their adopted daughter, a hut for the men, a storehouse for provisions, and a cook-house, all united by arched galleries built of consolidated snow, with 1 main entrance and smaller ones branching off to the several apartments or huts. Hans built his igloo separately but close by. All were constructed after the Eskimo fashion. That is, the ground being leveled off, 1 half of the floor toward the end furthest from the entrance was slightly raised above the other or front half. The raised part, as we have previously explained, serves as parlor and bedroom, the lower area as workshop and kitchen. The walls and arched roof were built up of square blocks of hard snow, packed hard and close by the force of the wind. A square of about 18 inches of this compressed snow or ice served for window. This good work done, Tyson took stock. Successive expeditions had gathered together nearly all that was on the ice when the Polaris drifted from them, and he found that their stores included 2 boats, one of which, however, was being broken up for fuel, and 1 kayak, a good supply of powder and shot, 11.5 bags of bread, 14 cans of pemmican, 14 hams, 10 dozen cans of meats and soups, 1 can of dried apples, and about 20 pounds of chocolate and sugar mixed. The pemmican cases were large, each weighing 45 pounds. The meats and soups were only 1 and 2 pound cans. The hams were small. The dried apple can counted for 22 pounds. Evidently, when divided among 19 people, this supply could not last many weeks. And unless they reached the land, or could catch seals, starvation seemed their probable ultimate fate. The allowance was reduced to 11 ounces for each adult, and half that amount for the children, rations painfully inadequate to the proper support of the human frame in a polar region and during an Arctic winter. Recovery of the boat by Captain Tyson. On the 23rd of October they lost sight of the sun. At this time they were about 8 or 10 miles offshore and 40 to 50 miles west of Northumberland Island in lat. 7730 nearly. The Eskimos were on the watch for seals day after day, but without success. In truth, it is not easy to find the seal in winter, as they live principally under the ice, and can be seen only when it cracks. A warm-blooded animal, it cannot always remain beneath the frozen surface without breathing, and for this purpose they make air holes through the ice and snow. These, however, 283 are so small at the surface, not exceeding 2.5 inches across, that they are not easily distinguished, especially in the twilight gloom of an Arctic winter day. The floe, or ice raft, on which the crew of the Polaris had found shelter, continued to drift slowly to the southward, impelled by wind and current. The weather was so severe that it was worse than useless to attempt to reach the shore. The castaways therefore huddled themselves together in their igloos, or huts of snow, or took such diversion as hunting for fox or seal afforded. Or when a gleam of fair weather afforded an opportunity, Tyson took a short drive in his sledge and explored as much as he dared of the ice lying towards the shore. On the 1st of November, an attempt was made to reach the land, the dogs being harnessed to the sledge, and the boat loaded with the most essential articles. But the state of the ice rendered all efforts of this kind fruitless. Igloos constructed by the castaways. One day, Joe and Hans, the Eskimos, went out in quest of game. In wandering through the hummocks, they lost one another, and Joe, after trying his luck alone, made his way back towards the hut before night came on. He fully anticipated to find that Hans had preceded him, and was much alarmed when he heard that he had not returned. Accompanied by Robert, he started in search of him. As they sped along through the rapidly gathering darkness, they saw what appeared to be a polar bear approaching them, loaded their pistols, and prepared to give him a warm reception, when, fortunately, the creature throwing up his arms and standing erect, they perceived that it was their missing comrade. He had used both hands and feet in climbing the rough hummocks, and his fur clothing being covered with snow, the deception was tolerably complete. On the 21st of November, Captain Tyson writes in his diary, "We are living now on as little as the human frame can endure without succumbing. Some tremble with weakness when they try to walk. Mr. Mayers suffers much from this cause. He was not well when he came on the ice, and the regimen here has not improved him. He lives with the men now. They are mostly Germans, and so is he, and the affinity of blood draws them together, I suppose. Since 284 he has housed with the men. I have lived in the hut with Joe, Hannah, and Punny. Punny, poor child, is often hungry. Indeed, all the children often cry with hunger. We give them all that it is safe to use. I can do no more, however sorry I may feel for them." But it is unnecessary to trace the misfortunes and sufferings of Captain Tyson's little company day by day. Their wretched condition, adrift on a raft of ice, insufficiently clothed, insufficiently fed, poorly housed, without any of the comforts that generally make an Arctic expedition endurable, buffeted by snowstorm and tempest, in constant apprehension lest their insecure raft should break up, requires no exaggeration of coloring to produce its full impression on the reader. In January 1873, it was found that the provisions were diminishing with terrible rapidity, and this was due not so much to the regular daily consumption as to the secret pilferings of the crew, who were not controlled by any bonds of discipline, and yielded Captain Tyson an imperfect and reluctant obedience. They were all Germans, except Heron, an Englishman, and the cook, a man of color, and their conduct was a disgrace to their nationality. They seemed to have thought that their raft was carrying them swiftly towards Disco in Greenland, where abundant supplies could easily be obtained. But in truth, they were drifting in the direction of Labrador, and the safety of all demanded the sternest economy of their small stock of provisions. Hans mistaken for a bear. Difficult traveling. The cold was now excessive, 35 below zero at noon and 37 at midnight. On the 13th, it sank below 40. On the following day, however, a strong westerly gale blew up, the cold became more moderate, the temperature rose to -14. Under the influence of the gale, the ice began to crack and grind and break up, the natives launched a kayak, a seal was hunted down, and the castaways feasted gloriously. This, however, was but a transient gleam of good fortune. On the 17th, the glass again sank to 38, and no more seals were visible. The men were now reduced to less than 12 ounces of food daily, which was not sufficient to furnish internal warmth, or to strengthen the system against the terrible effects of the Arctic climate. The 19th was, to some extent, a day of hope, for after an absence of 83 days, the sun once more rose above the misty horizon. Eskimo Joe took advantage of the burst of daylight to undertake a hunting expedition. About 5 miles from the hut he found open water, and shot 2 seals, but could land only one. The young ice carried the other away. Encouraged by the cheerful glow of the sun, he stayed out later than usual, and it was very dark before he returned. A light of burning blubber was kindled to guide him to the hut. It shone out upon the gloom of the night like a pharos. The guiding light. The 25th of January marked the 103rd day of the castaways' voyage on the ice raft, and they severely felt the monotonous wretchedness of their existence. It was a beautiful day, and perfectly calm, but the thermometer indicated 40 below zero. At midnight the heavens were illuminated with all the glories of a brilliant aurora. They seemed to be ablaze. From the southwest to the northeast, from the horizon to the zenith, the magnetic fires shot here and there, and wavered and undulated, like flame driven by a strong wind. At one time the splendor was almost overpowering, and the straining eye was fain to seek relief in darkness. On the 1st of February a violent gale arose, blowing from the northwest, and the ice, rolling and rocking beneath its influence, split up into great cracks and fissures which threatened the safety of the castaways. Huge blocks fell off from the floe, and the vast bergs which had hitherto accompanied, and partly sheltered it, moved rapidly before the wind. 288 Everything acknowledged the might of the storm, but as yet the adventurers had not been disturbed, though surrounded by mountains of ice heavy enough, if driven against their encampment, to have crushed them to atoms. Thus far they had floated safely, but the position was one to cause reflection. At some time or other the ice must break up, they knew, but whether they would survive the catastrophe was beyond conjecture. They could only wait and hope. Dragging a seal. Here is a picture of the interior of one of the igloos, or snow huts. Joe and Hannah are sitting in front of the lamp, playing checkers on an old piece of canvas, the squares being marked out with Tyson's pencil. They use buttons for men, as they have nothing better. The natives easily learn any sort of game, some of them can even play a respectable game of chess, and cards they understand as well as the heathen chinny. Cards go wherever sailors go, and the first lessons that the natives of any uncivilized country get are usually from sailors. Little Punny, Joe and Hannah's adopted child, a little girl, is sitting wrapped in a muskox skin. Every few minutes she says to her mother, "I am so hungry." The children often cry with hunger. It makes one's heart ache, but they are obliged to bear it with the rest. The gale continued on the 2nd, with blinding showers of snow, fine, penetrating, pungent. 291 Next day the weather moderated, and the glass rose to 15 below zero. Dark clouds lowered in the horizon, preventing the land from being seen if any shore were near. But the rapid rise in the temperature, after so strong a northwest gale, allowed Tyson to hope that the wind had mastered the current, and was forcing them towards the Greenland shore. Return of the sun. Though all around nothing was visible but ice and icebergs, the scene had a certain beauty of its own, a strange, weird beauty, like that of a dream picture. When the sun shone on the bergs, and lighted up their massive or fantastic forms, all the prismatic colors of the rainbow flashed through the crystal pendants or projecting peaks. The interest of the scene was enhanced by the variety of its forms. Every berg appeared to have had its individual history, and its broken outline and furrowed surface bore witness to the experiences it had undergone: storm and rain, wind and water. Some rose up around the castaways like solid ramparts. Others represented the spire of a Gothic cathedral, the pinnacle of a Turkish minaret, the glittering walls of a palace. All were beautiful, yet terrible in their beauty, conveying a profound feeling of might and destructive power. Shooting narwhal. On the 5th, and again on the 7th, a seal was caught, and the little company enjoyed a plentiful meal. On the latter day a couple of narwhals were shot, but both sank before they could be reached. These narwhals are sometimes called sea unicorns, or monodons, in allusion to the long horn, 6 to 8 feet in measurement, or rather the elongated tooth which projects from the upper jaw, a formidable weapon, tapering from base to point, with a spiral twist from left to right. Strange stories were told of these sea unicorns by the early navigators, but science has made short work of legend and fable. Day after day, the history of our navigators was the same. No stirring romance, but harsh reality. Wind and snow, snow and wind. A wind which almost froze the lifeblood of those exposed to it, and snow which fell so fast and thick as to wrap the scene in the gloom of desolation. 292 Still, the ice raft drifted southward. Slowly but surely drifted through the darkness of the night and the twilight obscurity of the day. While the little company it carried suffered much from increasing weakness, though better provided with food than formerly, owing to the frequent capture of narwhal and seal. Occasionally the mists cleared off and the sun streamed out in meridian splendor, lighting up every feature of the ice-scape, may we coin the word, around them. But too frequently, snow and blow and snow was, as Tyson remarks, the order of the day. Hope lives eternal in the human breast, and though it had sunk very low in the hearts of our adventurers, it suddenly rekindled on the 19th of February, when they caught sight of the west coast, at no greater distance than 38 or 40 miles. Its flame was kept alive on the 21st by the discovery that the thermometer had risen to 3 above zero. Next day it had risen to 20, or within 12 of freezing point, and men inured to the rigor of an Arctic winter spoke of such weather with cheeriness as very comfortable. The cloud upon the prospect now was the want of food, for the game had begun to fail. The hunters went forth every morning, but returned empty-handed. The feebleness of the party increased in an alarming degree. It took several men to carry a light Eskimo kayak, which for an ordinary man is not even a burden. What was to be done? The only chance of life seemed to lie in reaching the shore, but how were these gaunt, frail skeletons to convey their boat across the rugged ice until they reached the open water? They decided, however, on making the attempt, in the hope of reaching a place called Shaman, a little to the north of Cape Mercy in lat. 65N, where game and sometimes Eskimos were to be found. In spite of all their efforts, they were foiled by a succession of blinding, lashing, beating snowstorms. The mercury sank again to 24 below zero, and their position grew desperate. They were reduced to one meal, and such a meal, per diem. Great was their joy on the 28th when the hunters brought in 37 dovekais, or 2 apiece. 295 they were cooked without delay, and eaten up to the last morsel, except the feathers. Greater still was their joy on the 2nd of March, when Eskimo Joe shot a monster ujuk, a large kind of seal, the largest they had ever seen, such a monster that it took all hands to drag its carcass to the huts. Peter danced and sung in the exuberance of his delight, and everybody felt that for a time they were saved from starvation. On measurement, this glorious ujuk proved to be 7 feet 9 inches in length, or fully 9 feet including the tail. The ice raft was now approaching Cumberland Gulf, and Tyson calculated that they had reached lat. 65N. They drifted more and more rapidly, and if they did not die of famine, if the ice did not break up too suddenly, there was a probability of their reaching the whaling ground and falling in with some friendly ship. The gales, however, were frequent and severe. The thermometer continued very low, 32 to 34 below zero, and the sufferings of the whole company were intense. Even the Eskimos were sorely afflicted, though without these bold and patient hunters, the white men must certainly have perished. First sight of a whale. On the 7th of March there were indications of the breaking up of the floe. It cracked and snapped beneath them, with a sound like that of distant thunder. So far as the surface was concerned, however, no signs of fracture were visible. The eye, straining in every direction, saw nothing but an unbroken expanse of ice. And thus it continued until the 12th, when, during a terrible storm, the threatened catastrophe took place, the ice raft being shattered suddenly into hundreds of pieces, on one of which, not more than 100 yards by 75, the 296 adventurers found themselves adrift. Oh, what a night of dread anxiety they passed, expecting every moment that this piece too would give way, and plunge them into ruin. But it held together, and when the wind abated and the snow ceased to fall and the wild hurtling of the broken ice was hushed, they could look around them and realize their position. The condition of the ice had undergone an absolute change. The floes were driven up into a pack, and huge blocks of all shapes and sizes were heaped up and jammed together in inextricable confusion. Face to face with a polar bear. Noting that on the 21st of March 7 seals replenished the empty larder of our adventurers, and that on the 26th whales were visible for the first time, a welcome sign, as indicating their approach to the fishing grounds, we pass on to the 29th, which was marked by a curious incident. Shortly after dark, Tyson heard a noise outside his hut. He had just taken off his boots, preparing for rest. Joe, too, was on the point of retiring, but thinking the ice was breaking up, he went out to view the situation. In a few seconds he hastily returned, pallid and frightened, and exclaiming, "There is a bear close to my kayak." The kayak lay within 10 feet of the entrance to the hut. Both Joe and Tyson's rifles were outside, Joe's within the kayak and Tyson's lying close to it, but Joe had his pistol in the hut. The captain put on his boots, and then both crept cautiously out. Sealskins and lumps of blubber were lying about in all directions, and Bruin, having dragged some of these about 30 feet from the kayak, was banqueting at his ease. Joe crept into the sailor's hut to alarm them. Meantime, Tyson crawled 299 stealthily to his rifle, but in taking it knocked down a shotgun standing by. The bear heard it, but Tyson's rifle already covered him. He growled. Tyson pulled the trigger, but the gun would not go off a second and a third time. It did not go, but Tyson did, for the bear now rushed full upon him. Retiring to the hut, he put another cartridge in, and then again crept out into the open, taking up a position where he could see the animal, although the night was dark. The bear, too, saw his assailant and faced towards him, but this time the rifle ball went straight to its mark. The bear ran about 2 rods and fell dead. The victim was a sea bear, Ursus maritimus, and supplied the company on the ice raft with a welcome change of diet. On board the boat. Breaking up of the ice. Joe captures a seal. As the piece of ice was gradually wearing away, the adventurers of the Polaris resolved on an effort to regain the main pack, which would necessarily be safer. With their sleeping gear, tent, and a supply of shot and powder, they embarked on board the boat and stood to the westward. And on the 4th of April, after a succession of rough experiences, reached the pack. Here they were not much better off, for a violent gale blowing from the northeast, the ice began to break off in huge fragments, and soon the area at the command of the navigators was so small that they were compelled to reload the boat and prepare for a hurried departure. The wind, however, subsided, the pack closed up, and things returned to their normal condition. On the 18th of April, the castaways were somewhat reinvigorated by the capture of a seal 300, which Joe brought ashore in his kayak, and by the appearance of land to the southwest. But in this wild Arctic region, the weather in spring is subject to surprising changes, and on the 20th another gale began to blow. Such was its fury that it drove a heavy swell of sea across the ice raft, which washed away every article that was loose. Billow after billow followed with ever-increasing violence, and tent and skins and nearly all the bedgear were swept into the boiling waters. Only a few articles were saved, which, along with the women and children, had been stowed in the boat. To save the boat tasked the energies of all the party, who had to hold on to it, with might and main, to prevent it from being carried out to sea. All through the 303 dreadful night, the men were on the watch against this crowning disaster. All through the dreary night, from 9 p.m. until 7 a.m., straining every nerve, calling into play every resource of energy. Ever and anon, one of the tremendous billows would plunge downward, and lift the boat bodily, and the men with it, and carry it and them forward on the ice, almost to the opposite edge of the floating raft. Several times the boat heeled partly over, and was hauled back only by the more than human strength which the crew derived from a knowledge of their position. The boat gone, all was lost. Terrible was the work. Had the waters been smooth, the task would not have been easy, but they were filled with loose ice, which rolled about in blocks of all shapes and sizes, and with almost every wave these came toppling and rolling and driving forward like an avalanche, and fell about the heads and limbs of the men as they clung desperately to the boat. But God mercifully supplied them with the strength they needed, and so, laboring to the uttermost, they waited and watched for the day. For 12 hours scarcely a sound was uttered except the crying of the children, and Tyson's stern command to hold on, or bear down, with the responsive "Aye, aye, sir" of the men. A hell of waters. Day dawned at last, with a dull gray light over the restless sea, and Tyson saw with indescribable thankfulness a large raft of ice floating within reach. He determined to make for it, though the men hesitated to launch the boat into such a hell of waters. But it was done. The women and children were first got on board, and then all the men embarked in safety. By dint of hard pulling, they gained the ice, landed, refreshed themselves with a morsel of food 304 and then, on this new ice raft, laid down to rest. The following morning found them safe and sound, after all their trials, with the exception of a few bruises and contusions. On the 22nd of April, another bear was killed, and just in time, for the whole party were without a morsel of food. This lasted them for 3 or 4 days, and then, on the 25th, as starvation once more stared them in the face, they resolved on a desperate effort to make the land. What else were they to do? The rain fell in torrents, the wind blew a hurricane, the ice raft was constantly wasting away, they had no provisions. True, the boat was frail and leaky, and the sea ran high, but as the ice would not much longer afford them even a footing, a decision was forced upon them. Dragging the boat onto a floe. So in their crippled, overloaded boat they set out, the wind blowing a gale, and a tremendous sea running, full of small knife-like blades of ice. After 8 hours' labor at the oars, they came to a piece of floe and encamped upon it for the night. At daylight on the 28th they again launched their boat, and after much weary work in threading their way through a fleet of icebergs, they got into comparatively open water. At 4:30, a joyful sight. A steamer right ahead and bearing north of them. The castaways hoisted their colors and pulled towards her. She was a sealer going southwest and making her way through the floating ice. The hearts of the castaways beat with joy at the prospect of speedy relief, but alas, they were doomed to disappointment. She did not see the miserable little company in the overloaded boat, and it was impossible for them to overtake her. Night gathered over the sea, and she disappeared. Reaching a suitable piece of floe, they boarded it, and again encamped for the night, under a sky which was clear and calm and shone with the glory of stars. The sea, too, was tranquil, and notwithstanding their disappointment, they felt more hopeful than before. It was evident they had reached the borders of civilization and might rely upon obtaining help. With seals' blubber they kindled beacon fires on the ice and divided their men into 2 watches. The next day they sighted another steamer, launched their boat, and pulled lustily towards her. In vain, she did not see them, and after a couple of hours' hard work they were hemmed in by the ice and could make no progress. They landed on a floe and hoisted their colors, collected and loaded all their rifles and pistols, and filled the echoes with the ringing report of 3 simultaneous volleys. They heard 3 shots in reply, and glorious sight, saw the steamer directing her course towards them. They shouted with all their might, but in the keen air their voices seemed to pass away soundlessly. Presently the steamer changed her course, tacking south, then north, then west, as if she were vainly endeavoring to force a passage through the accumulated ice. Yet there seemed no insuperable obstacle in her path. The fugitives fired again and again, but she came no nearer, and late in the afternoon steamed away to the southwest. At sunset they descried land in the same direction, about 35 miles distant. On the following day, the 30th of April, Tyson was lying in the boat, his watch having just ended, when the lookout raised a sudden shout. "There's a steamer! There's a steamer!" As if fresh life had been poured into his veins, Tyson sprang to his feet, ordered all the guns to be fired, joined his companions in a loud simultaneous cry, and raised their colors to the head of the boat's mast. Hans leaped into his kayak, and was dispatched to intercept the ship if possible, as there was some danger of losing sight of her in the fog which prevailed. But happily she bore down towards them. Hans paddled on, and in his broken English shouted, "American steamer." He was not understood by those on board, but they kept their course, and in a few minutes lay alongside of the ice isle which sheltered Tyson and his company. Oh, what 3 loud, hearty, joyful cheers acknowledged their deliverance! These were immediately returned by the crew of the steamer, which proved to be the sealer Tigress, of Conception Bay, Newfoundland. We quote from Captain Tyson's simply worded narrative. 2 or 3 of their small seal boats were instantly lowered. We, however, now that relief was certain, threw everything from our own boat, and in a minute's time she was in the water, while the boats of the Tigress came on, and the crews got on our bit of ice, and peeped curiously into the dirty pans we had used over the oil fires. We had been making soup out of the blood and entrails of the last little seal which Hans had shot. They soon saw enough to convince them that we were in sore need. No words were required to make that plain. Taking the women and children in their boats, we tumbled into our own, and were soon alongside of the Tigress. We left all we had behind, and our all was simply a few battered smoky tin pans and the debris of our last seal. It had already become awful in our eyes, though we had often been glad enough to get such fare. On stepping on board, I was at once surrounded by a curious lot of people. I mean men filled with curiosity to know our story, and all asking questions of me and the men. I told them who I was and where we were from. But when they asked me, "How long have you been on the ice?" and I answered, "Since the 15th of last October," they were so astonished that they fairly looked blank with wonder. One of the party, looking at me with open-eyed surprise, exclaimed, "And was you on it night and day?" The peculiar expression of the tone, with the absurdity of the question, was too much for 308 my politeness. I laughed in spite of myself, and my long, unexercised risibles thrilled with an unwanted sensation. Tyson and his party were picked up in lat. 5335 N, a fact which will give the reader some idea of the wonderful voyage they had accomplished on their various ice rafts. They were treated with thoughtful kindness on board the Tigress, which on the 7th of May turned her head towards Newfoundland. On the following day she put into Conception Bay, where the Americans landed, and remained until the 12th. They then started for St. John's, and the news of their remarkable experiences having preceded them, found themselves on their arrival the objects of a very general and lively curiosity. After a short stay, they were conveyed to Washington on board the United States steamship Frolic. And here ends their strange, eventful history. We must now return to the Polaris. When she drifted away in the darkness of that stormy night, she had on board 14 persons: Captain Buddington, Dr. Emil Bessel, Messrs. Bryan and Chester, and 10 officers and seamen. What had become of them and their vessel? Such was the natural question which arose on the safe arrival at Washington of Tyson and his companions, and the American government quickly came to the determination of organizing a relieving party to seek for and bring back the survivors and remains, if any, of the Polaris expedition. The steamship Juniata was immediately dispatched to form a depot of supplies on the coast of Greenland in advance. She reached Upernavik on the 31st of July, and there brought into use her steam launch, the little Juniata, which, manned by a gallant crew, pushed forward into the icy waters of Melville Bay, but without coming upon any traces of the missing explorers. Meantime, the American government purchased the Tigress and fitted her up for a thorough cruise in the Arctic seas. With Captain Greer in command, and Mr. Tyson as acting lieutenant, and a crew of 11 officers and 42 men, all told, the Tigress set sail on the evening of July 14th and dropped anchor at St. John's on the morning of the 23rd. On the 11th of August, we find her at Upernavik, where she took on board a supply of coal from the Juniata. She then proceeded northward, falling in with the heavy pack ice near Cape York. The 14th saw her off the Eskimo settlement of Netlik. She was now approaching Northumberland Island, in the neighborhood of which, or of Littleton Island, it was supposed the Polaris had parted from the ice floe. Captain Greer carefully examined Northumberland Island, but without success. He then made for Littleton Island, and a boat was lowered to go on shore, carrying Lieutenant White, Captain Tyson, and other officers. What was their surprise, as they approached, to discover some human figures and a couple of tents on the mainland, near Littleton Island. The figures proved to be Eskimos, and through the agency of Eskimo Joe, who was on board the Tigress, it was soon ascertained that Captain Buddington had deserted the Polaris on the day after her separation from the floe, that he and his companions had erected a house on the mainland and wintered therein, had fitted it up with sleeping berths for 14 men, the full number, and furnished it with stove, table, chairs, and other articles removed from the abandoned ship, that during the winter the party had built and equipped a couple of sailing boats, and that, about the time when the ducks began to hatch, they had departed for the south. Saved! The Eskimo chief or leader added that Captain Buddington had made him a present of the Polaris, but that the gift proved of no effect, for in a violent gale she broke loose from the ice, drifted out into the channel, and foundered. Further search brought the crew of the Tigress to the winter camp of the Polaris crew. It was situated in lat. 7823 N and long. 7346 W. Some manuscripts were found there, with the logbook, the medical stores, and remains of instruments. And these, with whatever else that seemed of intrinsic value, having been removed on board the Tigress, the expedition bore away to the southward, and on the 16th of October reached St. John's, Newfoundland, where they received the welcome intelligence of the rescue of the Polaris party under the circumstances we shall now relate. We return to the eventful night of the 15th of October 1872. During the tremendous gale that then raged along the Arctic coast, the bow hawser of the Polaris snapped like a pack thread, the anchors slipped, and the ship drifted away into the darkness. The wind forced her in a northeasterly direction, and next morning those on board found her, a little north of Littleton Island, in Smith Sound, having been exactly abreast of Sutherland Island during a portion of the night. As she was leaking rapidly, the pumps were set to work, and the fires with much difficulty being lighted, the ship was got to obey her helm. It was then found that the following officers and men remained on board: Captain Buddington, Mr. Chester, chief mate; William Merton, second mate; Emil Schumann, chief engineer; Odell, assistant engineer; Campbell and Booth, firemen; Coffin, carpenter; seamen Hobby, Hayes, and Manch, seamen; Dr. Emil Bessel, meteorologist; and Mr. Bryan, astronomer and chaplain. A lookout was kept, it is said, for the 19 who were missing, but no signs of them being discovered, Captain Buddington came to the comfortable conclusion that they had saved themselves in the boats. Doubting the feasibility of carrying the Polaris to the southward, he determined to abandon her and winter on shore. With this view, she was run in as near land as possible, and finally grounded in Kane's Lifeboat Cove, lat. 7823 N, and long. 7321 W here. On the 17th of October, Captain Buddington prepared to establish a winter camp, and the next few days were occupied in removing from the stranded vessel all the food and fuel, and such articles as could conduce to the comfort and sustenance of the party through the ensuing winter. With spars, bulkheads, and canvas brought from the Polaris, a commodious house was erected, measuring 22 feet in length and 14 feet in width. It was thoroughly watertight, warmed inside by a stove, and banked outside with masses of compact snow. In the interior, the sides were lined with 14 sleeping berths. A table and chairs and lamps added to the general comfort, so that our explorers were prepared to brave a polar winter under more favorable conditions than those experienced by most Arctic navigators. In the course of a few days, a party of native Eskimos, with 5 sledges, made their appearance, and their friendly labors were found of no little value. They considered themselves amply repaid by a few presents of knives, needles, and the like, and after a short stay returned to their settlement at Etta. However, others soon took their place, and eventually 2 or 3 families built their igloos in the neighborhood of the American camp. The Eskimo women made themselves very useful by making and repairing clothing, and rendering other feminine courtesies, while the men, when game became plentiful, supplied the little settlement with a welcome abundance of fresh meat. Nor was this the only advantage derived from the presence of the Eskimos. On the contrary, it had an excellent effect on the morale of the men, who did not feel that utter isolation, that sense of being cut off from human companionship and separated from the rest of the world, which is one of the severest trials of wintering in the Arctic regions. The heavy pressure of the long, dark polar night was wonderfully lightened by the kindly attentions and mirthful society of the Eskimos. It is probable that some of the Polaris crew never spent a happier winter. There was no want of food, no suffering from cold. Their quarters were warm, cheerful, and well-lighted. Time did not hang heavily on their hands, for when the housework was done, when the fires were replenished, the lamps trimmed, and the day's provisions cooked, they amused themselves with reading or writing or played at chess, draughts, and cards. It is true they had no communication with the world without, and no intelligence could reach them from friends or kinsmen, but surgit amari aliquid, in the cup of human happiness a bitter drop is always found. When the worst of the winter was past, they began, under the direction of the carpenter, to construct a couple of boats, with the view of returning homeward as soon as the ice broke up. Each was 25 feet long, square fore and aft, and 5 feet beam, capable, that is, of carrying 7 men, with provisions for about 2 months, in which time they might reasonably calculate on reaching the civilized settlements. It was the end of May before the condition of the ice enabled them to set out. Then they broke up their camp, rewarded their Eskimo friends, carried on board stores and provisions, and finally, early on the morning of the 1st of June, they bade farewell to their winter home and sailed out into the waters of Smith Sound. Their voyage was unmarked by any disastrous incident and presents a strange contrast to the dangerous experiences of Tyson and his companions. Wherever they landed, they obtained an abundant supply of aquatic birds, seal, and other game. They were all in good health, well-fed, well-clothed. Their boats were sound and strong. The winter had long passed away, and the glorious summer sun poured its full radiance on the calm surface of the Arctic Sea. Sailing pleasantly along, they touched at Hakluyt Island and subsequently landed on the west shore of Northumberland Island. The pack ice detained them there until the 10th. They then entered a waterway toward Cape Parry, but were subsequently forced back by the ice to the place whence they had started. On the 12th, the channel was clearer. They set sail again, crossed the southern part of Murchison Sound, doubled Cape Parry, and halted for rest and refreshment on Blackwood Point, near Fitzclarence Rock. Thence they made, in due succession, for Wolstenholme Island and Cape York, names which recall the adventures of the earlier explorers. Their course now assumed a more difficult character, as they had come face to face with the ice of Melville Bay, that great expanse of Arctic waters which is surrounded by glacier-loaded shores, and has always been a favorite whaling ground. Here they encountered some difficulty with the pack, the leads, or waterways, curiously intersecting one another, and striking far into the ice, and so closing up that it was often necessary to haul their boats across a kind of promontory, or tongue, from one lead to another. Their troubles, however, were of 313 brief duration. On the 20th day after leaving Lifeboat Cove, they sighted a steamer, beset in the ice, at a distance of 30 or 35 miles from Cape York. She could not come to them, it was true, but they could go to her, and this they prepared to do. They had not traversed half the distance, however, before they met a body of 18 men from the ship, for they too had been seen, and recognized as white men, and relief immediately dispatched. The friendly vessel proved to be the Raven Scrag of Dundee, Captain Allen, lying in lat. 7538 N and long. 6535 W. It was now found, according to the narrative of the expedition, that the relief did not come much too soon, for the boats had been considerably injured by contact with the rough hummocky ice, and the fatigue of hauling them over such a surface may be inferred from the fact that it took the Polaris crew, with their 18 relief men from the Raven Scrag, 6 hours to reach the latter vessel. The difficulty was increased by a deep slushy snow, which lay thick upon the ice, and which was not only heavy and disagreeable to the wayfarer, but exceedingly dangerous, as more than one found by sinking into the pitfalls it treacherously concealed. But they reached the Raven Scrag at midnight, and received a hearty welcome from Captain Allen, who was able also to communicate the grateful intelligence that their comrades, the little company sent adrift on the ice raft, were all in safety. It has been well said that the Polaris expedition proved curiously prolific of startling and exciting incidents. From the time when Captain Bartlett of the Tigris rescued the exhausted waifs of the ice floe, until the last scene in this romantic drama was enacted, the public mind had been kept in a condition of continual expectancy by the progress of events connected with the story of these Arctic explorers. The lamentable death of Captain Hall, the long voyage on the ice floe through the gloom of the polar night, the return of the 19 castaways after so many hairbreadth escapes and wonderful adventures, the departure of the Tigress, the discovery of Buddington's winter camp, and now the rescue of him and his crew by the Dundee whaler, formed a series of surprising and exciting events which, if not of epical interest, would certainly seem to furnish matter for a poet's song. Even the early annals of Arctic exploration, with their narratives of the achievements and sufferings of Hudson, Davis, Barents, present no incidents of a more remarkable character. As men dwelt upon them, they came to acknowledge that the age of romance was not ended yet. On the 18th of September 1873, the Arctic whaling steamer arrived at Dundee with 11 of the Polaris survivors, who had been transferred to her from the Raven Scrag, as the latter was not homeward bound. 3 others reached America in the Intrepid, and thus the expedition of the Polaris terminated without any loss of life, if we accept the unfortunate death of her enthusiastic commander, Captain Hall. It added nothing, it is true, to our geographical knowledge of the Arctic world, and yet it was not without some useful results. The Polaris, at all events, approached nearer to the North Pole than any one of her predecessors, and men of science were thenceforth justified in asserting that the hope of complete success was no longer chimerical. The distance to the pole from the point reached by the Polaris was comparatively so trivial as to afford good reason for believing that it would not long baffle human resolution and enterprise. Then, again, it was established as a fact beyond doubt that Europeans could securely winter in a latitude of 81°38, that a ship well built 314 and well equipped might push northward as far as 82°16, and that no insuperable obstacles to its further advance could then be detected. It was also shown that the temperature, even in lat. 82, was not of a nature to overcome the energy and enthusiasm of men accustomed to life and adventure in the Arctic world. These data, so conclusively established by experience, constituted a source of great encouragement to future navigators, and permit the conclusion that the Polaris expedition, with all its disasters and mismanagement, helped forward the great work of discovering the North Pole. We now know, says Mr. Markham, that the American vessel commanded by Captain Hall passed up the strait in one working season for a direct distance of 250 miles, without a check of any kind, reaching lat. 82°16 N, and that at her furthest point the sea was still navigable with a water sky to the northward. The Polaris, however, was nothing better than a river steamer of small power, ill adapted for encountering the perils of Arctic navigation, with a crew, all told, of 30 men, women, and children, including 8 Eskimos. If she could accomplish such a voyage without difficulty, and could attain so high a latitude, it was reasonable to anticipate that a properly equipped English expedition, under equally favorable circumstances, would do not only as much, but much more, and carry the British flag into the waters of the circumpolar sea, if such existed. With this view, the Admiralty fitted out the Alert and the Discovery, under Captains Nares and Stephenson. Every precaution that science could suggest was adopted to ensure the completeness of their equipment, and the two ships, accompanied as far as Disco by HMS Valorous as a tender, left England on the 29th May 1875. The British expedition, consisting of the Alert and the Discovery, did not succeed in all it was intended to accomplish, and yet it can hardly be spoken of as a failure. It did not reach that conventional point of geographers, the North Pole, but it penetrated within 400 miles of it, and it ascertained the exact nature of the obstacles which render access impossible, except under conditions not at present in existence. We agree with a thoughtful writer in The Spectator that this was a most important service, rendered both to science and the state. We now know that by the Smith Sound route a ship may attain to within 450 miles of the pole, and that afterwards, a journey about as long as from London to Edinburgh must be undertaken, in a rigorous climate, with the thermometer 50 below zero, over ice packed up into hillocks and hummocks, which render sledge traveling almost impracticable, or practicable only by hewing out a path with the pickaxe at the rate of 1.5 miles a day. And further, the work would have to be begun and completed in 4 months, or from lack of light and warmth it could not be done at all. These are serious difficulties, and whether it is worthwhile for men to encounter them, where the gain would be problematical, we need not here inquire. Before any attempt can be made, some provision must be discovered for protecting those who make it against the excessive cold, and for a surer and swifter mode of conveyance than the sledge affords. The journalist to whom we have referred speculates that science may furnish future expeditions with undreamt-of resources, with portable light and heat, for instance, from the newly discovered mines at Disco, preventives against scurvy, electric lights, supplies of dynamite for blowing up the ice, and a traction engine to traverse the road thus constructed. But in 315 the meantime, these appliances are not at our command. We must be content with the measure of success achieved by Captain Nares and his gallant followers. And these well deserve the gratitude of all who think the fame and honor of a nation are precious possessions. They have shown clearly that the race has not degenerated, that Englishmen can do and suffer now as they did, and suffered in the old time. They displayed a courage and a fortitude of truly heroic proportions, and the experiences of Arctic voyaging are always of a nature to require the highest courage and the sternest fortitude. The long Arctic night is in itself as severe a test of true manhood as can well be devised. The miner works under conditions far less laborious than those to which the Arctic explorer submits, for he enjoys an alternation of light and darkness. His underground toil lasts but for a few hours at a time. Yet we know that it tries a man's manly qualities sorely. What, then, must it be to keep brave and cheerful and true throughout a prolonged night of 142 days, that apparently endless darkness, almost the darkness of a sunless world? We know, too, that continuous work, without relaxation, for month after month, will break down the nerves and shatter the intellect of the strongest. Yet we read that the men of the Alert toiled like slaves, on one occasion, for 72 days, in cold so extreme that the reader can form no conception of its severity, and with the dread constantly hanging over them of that terrible and most depressing disease, scurvy. Owing to their inability to procure any fresh game, as most former expeditions had done, each of the extended sledge parties, when at their farthest distance from any help, was attacked by it. The return journeys were, therefore, a prolonged homeward struggle of men who grew weaker at every step, the available force to draw the sledge continually decreasing, and the weight to be dragged as steadily increasing, as, one after another, the men stricken down had to be carried by their enfeebled comrades. It has been well said that in such exploits as these there is a sustained heroism which we cannot fully appreciate, because we cannot fully realize the terrible character of the sacrifices involved. But it is comparatively easy for us to understand, and therefore to admire, the courage of Lieutenant Parr, when he started alone on a journey of 35 miles, with no other guide for his adventurous steps than the fresh track of a wandering wolf over the ice and snow, in order to carry help and comfort to his failing comrades. It is easy to understand, and therefore to admire, the devotion of Mr. Edgerton and Lieutenant Rawson, when, at the imminent risk of their own lives, they nursed Peterson, the interpreter, while traveling from the Alert to the Discovery, with the temperature 40 below zero. Peterson, who had accompanied them with the dog sledge, fell ill, and with a noble unselfishness, they succeeded in retaining heat in the poor fellow's body by alternately lying one at a time alongside of him, while the other by exercise was recovering his own vital warmth. We can also acknowledge and admire the constancy of Captain Nares, who, in that horrible climate, lived 36 days in the crow's nest, while his ship labored among the grinding, shivering, crushing ice until exhaustion overcame him. And we can acknowledge and admire the bravery and faithfulness of the men of the sledge parties, who, for days and weeks, drew the sledges and their comrades, with gloom above and around them, ice and snow everywhere bounding the prospect, and in a temperature which seemed to freeze the blood and benumb the heart. What a tale, says a writer in the Times, what a tale of unrequited suffering it is. Surely not unrequited. For those who suffered at the call of duty, and have been rewarded 316 by the approval of their countrymen, and by the consciousness of having done something great, of not having lived in vain. How lightly do all talk of glory, how little do they know what it means. The little army had to cut its way through the ice barriers, dragging heavily laden sledges and going to and fro, the whole force being often required for each sledge, content to make 1.25 miles a day, in pursuit of an object still 400 miles off, through increasing difficulties, and with barely 5 months or 150 days, wherein to go and return. The labor is a dreadful reality, the scheme itself a nightmare, the fantasy of a disordered brain. Even the smaller and subsidiary expedition for planting a depot last autumn cost 3 amputations. The cold was beyond all former experience for intensity and length, and the physical effect of a long winter spent in the ships under such conditions is particularized as one reason why the men were less able to endure cold, labor, and the want of proper food. Every one of the expeditions, whatever the direction, came back in the saddest plight, some dragging the rest, and in one case only reaching the ship through the heroism of an officer pushing on many miles alone to announce his returning comrades, and to procure the aid by which alone they were saved from destruction. These are episodes, but they are the matter which redeems the story and makes its truest value. They tell us what Englishmen will do on occasions beyond our feeble home apprehensions, when once they have accepted a call and are in duty bound. At the time we write, no elaborate record of the expedition has been published, and the materials of the following sketch are collected therefore from various narratives which have appeared in the daily journals. We shall begin by endeavoring to place before the reader, with the assistance of Mr. Clements R. Markham, a rapid summary of what the expedition accomplished. And then we shall describe its more interesting incidents. The object of Captain Nares and his followers was to discover and explore as considerable a portion of the unknown area in the polar regions as was possible with reference to the means at their disposal, and to the positions the vessels succeeded in reaching as starting points. The theories about open polar basins and navigable waters, which once obtained, have long been discarded by practical Arctic geographers. A coastline, however, is needful as a means of progress to the threshold of work. And it is needful, too, in order to secure the desired results of Arctic discovery in the various departments of scientific inquiry. The expedition, then in the first place, had to force its way through the ice-encumbered channel which connects Baffin Bay with the polar ocean, a channel which successively bears the names of Smith Sound, Kane Basin, Kennedy Channel, Hall Basin, and Robeson Strait. Smith Sound opens out of Baffin Bay between Capes Alexander and Isabella. The Alert and the Discovery passed these famous headlands and entered the Sound on July 29, 1875, and from that date until September 1, when the Alert crossed the threshold of the unknown region, they fought one continuous battle with the ice. The Polaris, it is true, had made a rapid passage on the occasion of its memorable voyage, but the circumstances were exceptional. Generally, the Sound is blocked up by heavy flows, with winding waters caused by the action of wind and tide. With great difficulty, our 2 ships forced the barrier, but their success was due in no small measure to the skill and vigilance of Captain Nares, who allowed himself no rest 317 until they were out of danger. At length, after many hairbreadth escapes, and many laborious nights and days, and much energy and devotion on the part of the officers, and equal courage and industry on the part of the men, the expedition reached the north shore of Lady Franklin Inlet, and found a safe, commodious harbor in lat. 8144, and here the Discovery took up her winter quarters, as had previously been arranged, and the Alert, after a brief interval of repose, continued her northward progress. This she was enabled to do through the opportune opening up of a water lane between the shore and the ice. Bravely she dashed ahead, rounded Cape Union, so named by the men of the Polaris expedition, and entered the open polar ocean. Then, in lat. 8220 N, the white ensign was hoisted on board a British man-o-war in a latitude further north than the ship of any nation had reached before. Soon afterwards, the solid masses of the polar pack ice began to close around the adventurous vessel, and on the 3rd of September 1875, the Alert was fast fixed in her winter quarters, on the icebound shore of the inhospitable polar sea in lat. 8227 N. This, says Mr. Markham, 11 was the first grand success, and it assured the eventual completion of the work. For, owing to the admirable seamanship of Captain Nares, and to the zeal and devotion of the officers and crew, the Alert had been carried across the threshold, and was within the unknown region. A point of departure was thus obtained, which rendered certain the achievement of complete success. Inasmuch as in whatever direction the sledge parties traveled, valuable discoveries could not fail to be the result. The autumnal excursions, during which depots of provisions were established for use in the work of the coming spring, were not performed without a very considerable amount of suffering. Lieutenant May and 2 seamen were so severely frostbitten that, to save their lives, amputation was found necessary. As will be seen from the latitude given, the ships wintered further north than any ships had ever previously wintered. The cold exceeded anything previously registered, and darkness extended over a dreary period. The winter, however, was not spent idly. Observatories were erected, and a mass of valuable scientific data industriously accumulated. But the crowning glories of this ever-memorable campaign were, as Mr. Markham exclaims, achieved during the spring. 3 main sledge expeditions were organized. One, under Commander Markham and Lieutenant Parr, instructed to keep due north as far as possible into the newly discovered polar ocean. Another, under Lieutenant Aldrich, to explore the American coast, westward, and the third, under Lieutenant Beaumont of the Discovery, to survey the north coast of Greenland, facing eastward. Each party consisted of 2 sledges, and the 6, with their gallant crews, set out on the 3rd of April 1876, determined to vindicate and maintain the reputation of British seamen. They separated at Cape Joseph Henry, and before they again met, this was what they achieved. Commander Markham and Lieutenant Parr pushed northward as far as lat. 8320, 26 N, being the most northerly point which any explorers have attained. They may therefore be fairly and justly regarded as the champions of Arctic discovery, until some successors, more fortunate than they, shall surpass their glorious feat. Lieutenant Aldrich struck westward, rounded Cape Columbia in lat. 837 N, and explored 220 miles of the American coastline, previously not laid down on any map. Lieutenant Beaumont crossed Robeson Strait, and surveyed the northern coast of Greenland for about 70 miles. In order, it is said, that these 3 main parties might do their work successfully, every soul in the 2 ships was actively employed. The depot and relieving parties did most arduous work, and the officers vied with each other in promoting the objects of the expedition, while the most perfect harmony and unanimity prevailed. Captain Faildon and Mr. Hart were especially active in making natural history collections, and Lieutenants Gifford, Archer, Rawson, Edgerton, and Canibbare did admirable work in exploring and keeping open communications. When the sledge parties returned to the ships, Captain Nares found that they had suffered terribly, but he also found that their success had been complete. They had solved a geographical problem. No open sea surrounded the pole, as so many sanguine spirits had anticipated. The way northward was over a waste of ice broken up into hummocks and ponderous masses, and with the appliances they possessed further progress was impossible. The expedition had reached its ne plus ultra. The work was done, and Captain Nares perceived that nothing more could be gained, while valuable lives might be lost by remaining longer in the polar ocean. He decided upon returning to England, with the following rich results to show as the reward of an heroic enterprise. First, the expedition had discovered a great polar ocean, a knowledge of which cannot fail to prove of exceeding value to the hydrographer. Next, the shores of this ocean had been explored along 50 degrees of longitude, and important collections formed of specimens of the Arctic fauna, flora, and geology. The channel connecting the polar ocean with Smith Sound had also been carefully surveyed, and an accurate delineation effected of either shore. Geological discoveries of high value had also been made, as, for example, that of the former existence of an evergreen forest in lat. 8244 N, a fact significant of vast climatic changes. And lastly, interesting observations in meteorology, magnetism, tidal and electric phenomena, and spectrum analysis had been carefully recorded. The expedition of 1875-76 must, therefore, in view of these results, be classed among the most successful which ever adventured into Arctic waters, though it failed, like its predecessors, to gain the North Pole. The Alert and the Discovery left the shores of England in May 1875. After a voyage of 5 weeks' duration, they arrived at Lively, the port of Disco Island, on the west coast of Greenland. This small settlement numbers about 96 inhabitants, Danes and Eskimos, generally speaking, a mixed race. The Danish inspector of North Greenland resides here, and he received the expedition with a salute from 3 brass cannon planted in front of his house. There is a well-conducted school, attended by about 16 children, and a small church, where the schoolmaster reads the Lutheran service on Sundays, the priest coming over from Upernavik occasionally to perform marriages, christenings, and other religious services. The Alert having taken on board 30 Eskimo dogs and a driver, the expedition left Disco at 1 o'clock on July 16th, and next morning reached Kultanbunto, about 30 miles further north. Kultanbunto is a little island in the Strait of Waigatet, between Disco and the mainland. Here the Discovery took on board 30 dogs, and shooting parties from both ships made a 319 descent on a lumbary, or bird bazaar, frequented by guillemots, kittiwakes, and other ocean birds. 2 or 3 days later, the expedition arrived at a settlement named Proven, where it was joined by the Eskimo dog driver, Hans Christian, the attendant of Kane, Hayes, and Hall, in their several expeditions. At Proven the adventurers received and answered their last letters from home. Striking northward through Baffin Bay, they reached Cape York on the 25th of July and met with a company of the misnamed Arctic Highlanders, who traversed the ice floes in their dog sledges and soon fraternized with the seamen. A narwhal having been harpooned, a quantity of the skin and blubber was given to these Eskimos. Mr. Hodson, the chaplain of the Discovery, describes them as exceedingly greedy and barbarous, eating whatever fell in their way, but living chiefly upon seals. They were not so far advanced in civilization as to be able to construct kayaks, and apparently they had never before seen Europeans. They wore trousers of bearskin and an upper garment of seal skin. Proceeding northward by Dr. Kane's Crimson Cliffs, they soon reached that brave explorer's celebrated winter quarters, Port Falk, and took advantage of a day's delay to visit the Brother John Glacier. They found Dr. Kane's journal, but no relics, shot a reindeer, and a large number of birds. Between Melville Bay and the entrance to Smith Sound no ice was met with, but on the 30th of July the pack was sighted, off Cape Sabine in lat. 7841 N. Here, at Port Payer, the ships were fast held by the ice for several days. An attempt to proceed further northward was made to the west of the islands in Hayes Sound, but the waterway not leading in the right direction, the ships returned. On the 6th of August they made a fresh start, and thenceforward maintained an uninterrupted struggle with the ice. The Alert led the way, with Captain Nares in her crow's nest, anxiously looking out for practicable channels. At Cape Fraser the huge solid mass again delayed them. Then they succeeded in crossing Kennedy Channel to the east side and taking shelter in Petermann Fjord, so named after the great German geographer. After a few days they again pushed northward, and on the 25th of August, after many narrow escapes from being crushed in the ice, a well-sheltered harbor received them, on the west side of Hall Basin, north of Lady Franklin Sound, in lat. 8144 N. This was at once selected as the winter quarters of the Discovery. Her sister ship, continuing her course, rounded the northeast point of Grant Land. But instead of falling in with a continuous coastline, stretching 100 miles further towards the north, as all had anticipated, found herself on the border of what was evidently a very extensive sea, with impenetrable ice on every side. As no harbor could be found, the ship was secured as far north as possible, inside a kind of embankment of grounded ice close to the land. There she passed the winter, and during the 11 months of her detention no navigable waterway, through which she could move further to the north, presented itself. Far from meeting with the great polar sea, dreamed of by Kane and Hayes, our adventurers discovered that the ice barrier before them was unusually thick and solid. It looked as if composed of floating icebergs which had gradually been jammed and welded together. Henceforth it will be known on our maps as the Polycrystic Sea, or Sea of Ancient Ice, and a stranded mass of ice disrupted from an ice flow is to be termed a flowberg. Ordinary ice does not exceed 10 feet in thickness, but in the polar sea, generation after 320 generation, layer has been superimposed on layer, until the whole mass measures from 80 feet to 120 feet. It floats with its surface nowhere less than 15 feet above the waterline. It was this wonderful thickness which prevented the Alert from driving ashore. Owing to its great depth of flotation, 60 feet to 100 feet, the mass grounded on coming into shallow water and formed a breakwater within which the ship was comparatively secure. When two pieces of ordinary ice are driven one against the other, and the edges broken up, the crushed pieces are raised by the pressure into a high, long, wall-like hedge of ice. When two of the ancient flows of the polar sea meet, the intermediate lighter broken-up ice which may happen to be floating about between them alone suffers. It is pressed up between the two closing masses to a great height, producing a chaotic wilderness of angular blocks of all shapes and sizes, varying in height up to 50 feet above water, and frequently covering an area upwards of a mile in diameter. We must now return to the Discovery. As soon as she had taken up her winter quarters, her crew began to unload her, landing the boats, stores, and spare spars, and otherwise preparing for the winter. The first day ashore they shot a herd of 11 muskoxen. A few days afterwards the sea was frozen all round the ship, so that they could freely move to and fro about the ice. A week later they saw a large number of muskoxen, and shot about 40, thus laying in a considerable supply of provisions. Their winter port, which was surrounded by snow-clad hills, about 2,000 feet high, they christened Discovery Harbor. As soon as the sea was completely frozen over, the sledging parties were organized and duly dispatched, but as the autumn was rapidly passing, very little could be done in this direction. The usual preparations on the part of Arctic explorers were then made for hibernating. Houses were built, also a magnetic observatory and a theater of ice, recalling the glittering edifice constructed by Catherine Roman II. Of Russia on the Neva, and celebrated by Cowper in the well-known lines. No forest fell. When thou wouldst build, no quarry sent its stores to enrich thy walls, but thou didst hew the floods, and make thy marble of the glassy wave. A smithy was erected on the 11th of November, being the first the Arctic ice had ever borne. Its roof was made of coal bags, cemented with ice. The ship's stoker reigned supreme in it as blacksmith, and when we consider the accessories, the ice, the snow, the darkness, we must admit that his blazing forge must have made a curious picture. The chaplain tells us, humorously, that the smith adorned the interior wall with a good many holes, as each time that his iron wanted cooling, he simply thrust it into the ice. As for the theater, which, as we know, has always been a favorite source of amusement with Arctic explorers when winterbound, it was 60 feet long and 27 feet broad, and in honor of the Princess of Wales, was named the Alexandra. Her birthday was selected as the day of opening, December 1st, and the opening piece was a popular farce, My Turn Next. As sailors are generally adepts at dramatic personations, we may conceive that the piece went well, and that the different actors received the applause they merited. It 321 is recorded that foremost among them was the engineer, Mr. Miller, who appears to have been, emphatically, the polar star. Several of the men sung songs, and recitations, old and new, were occasionally introduced, the result of the whole being to divert the minds and keep up the spirits of the ship's company during the long, long Arctic night. The 5th of November and its time-honored associations were not forgotten. A huge bonfire blazed on the ice. A Guy Fawkes was manufactured and dressed in the most approved fashion, and the silence of the frozen solitudes was broken by the sounds of a grand display of fireworks and the cheering of the spectators. A fine level promenade had been constructed on the ice, about a mile in length, by sweeping away the snow, and this served as a daily exercise ground. A skating rink was also constructed. A free hole in the ice, for the sake of better ventilation, was carefully kept up. Whenever it closed, through a process of gradual congelation, the ice saws were set in motion to open it up again, or it was blasted with gunpowder. The dogs lived on the ice floe all the winter, It must not be thought that the cold was uniform day after day. Probably it is not the low temperature so much as the variable temperature that makes an Arctic winter so very trying to the European. In a few hours, the change would be no less than 60. The cold reached its height, or depth, in winter, when the thermometer marked 70-12 below zero, the greatest cold ever experienced by any polar expedition. It is difficult for the human frame to bear up against this excess of rigor, even with the help of good fires, good food, and good clothing. Not only the physical but the mental faculties are debilitated and depressed. Our icebound seamen, however, managed to keep Christmas merrily. Early on the day so dear to Christian memories, the waits went their usual rounds. A sergeant of Marines, the chief boatswain's mates, and 3 other volunteers, singing Christmas carols and making a special stay outside the captain's cabin. In the forenoon, prayers were said on the lower deck, after which the captain and officers visited the men's mess, tasting the Christmas pudding and examining the tasteful decorations which had been improvised. Then the gifts which, in anticipation of the day, had been sent out by kindly English hearts, were distributed by the captain, to each gift the name of the recipient having been previously attached. This was an affecting scene, and hearty, though not without a touch of pathos in them, were the cheers given as the distribution took place. A distribution recalling so many old familiar faces, and all the sweet associations and gentle thoughts of home. Cheers were also raised for the captain and men of the faraway Alert. Next, a choir was formed, and echo resounded with the strains of "Oh, the roast beef of old England," of which, no doubt, many of the singers entertained a very affectionate remembrance. The men dined at 12 and the officers at 5, and the day seems in every respect to have been most successful as a festival. A few particulars of the situation may here be given in the chaplain's own words. "We had brought fish, beef, and mutton from England," he says, "all of which we hung up on one of the masts, and it was soon as hard as a brick and perfectly preserved. We had also brought some sheep from England with us, and they were killed from time to time. When we arrived in Discovery Bay, as we called it, 6 of them were alive, but on being landed they were worried by the dogs and had to be slaughtered. During the winter the men had to fetch ice from a berg about half a mile distant from the ship in order to melt it for fresh water." At last the long Arctic night came to an end. It was with emotions of hope and gratitude and joy that the explorers welcomed the first rays of the returning sun on the last day of February. For 4 months they had lived in obscurity and gloom, with the exception of such relief as the stars and the moon had occasionally afforded. On the day of the sun's return to the polar world, it was known that it would rise at about 12 o'clock, and everybody ascended the hills for the purpose of hailing the glorious spectacle. The mists and fogs, however, baffled their expectations, and though they felt its influence, they did not see it for some days after it had mounted above the horizon. News was brought from the Alert by 2 officers and 2 men towards the end of March. They had accomplished the journey with the thermometer at 40 below zero and had occupied 6 days in making it. The officers were Lieutenant Rawson and Mr. Edgerton, who had started at first in company with Peterson, the interpreter, but had been compelled to return with him, as already narrated, because he was severely frostbitten. Directly they returned to the Discovery, preparations were made for sending out the sledge parties. 2 officers and 3 men, with a dog sledge, started across Robeson Channel to Hall's Rest, the winter quarters of the Polaris, to report on the stores left by the American vessel, which the United States government had placed at the disposal of the British expedition. They reappeared on the 5th day, with the information that they had found biscuit, pemmican, preserved meat, molasses, and other articles. They had lived in a wooden observatory that they found erected there. Captain Hall's grave was in excellent preservation, and they set up a headboard with an inscription on it to mark its situation. Lieutenant Beaumont and Mr. Coppinger, the surgeon, each with an 8-man sledge, or rather with 7 men besides themselves, started for the Alert, in quest of the other sledge which had wintered with that vessel, their design being to cross Robeson Channel and explore the North Greenland coast. In this journey, owing to the hummocky character of the ice, they spent 12 days. 2 days later, a third party, consisting of a 12-man sledge and an 8-man sledge, with 2 officers, proceeded to survey the shores of Lady Franklin Sound. The captain accompanied them in the 8-man sledge, and was absent about a week. But the 12-man sledge, which had gone merely to carry stores and provisions for the other, did not return for a fortnight, the sledge having been damaged, and one of the Marines severely frostbitten in the heel. The other sledge, after an absence of about 4 weeks, returned in safety, having discovered that Lady Franklin Strait, as the Americans call it, was a sound or fjord about 60 miles long. They had fallen in with some muskoxen, which were too wild to be got at, and had seen 3 or 4 glaciers and hills 3,000 feet in height. About June, the warm summer began to assert itself, and in the rays of the sun, their ice houses melted away, like the baseless fabric of a vision. So the sledging party last spoken of adventured across the ice to Polaris Bay, taking with them a lifeboat as a precaution, for the ice might at any time have broken up, and a supply of provisions for the use of the North Greenland expedition. This work done, they returned to the ship, leaving behind them 2 officers and 3 men, who pushed up Petermann Fjord for about 8 miles, until arrested by the impenetrable barrier of a huge glacier. On returning from their explorations, they found that Lieutenant Newsom, with 4 men, 323 of whom one had died of scurvy on the way, had accidentally separated from the North Greenland party and reached Petermann Fjord on the 3rd of June. All were seriously ill of scurvy, except Mr. Rawson and a Marine. Under Dr. Koppinger's skill and care, however, they recovered. As soon as possible, the doctor, with Mr. Newsom and the Eskimos, started in a dog sledge to gather some information about the other members of the North Greenland party. In a day or 2 they fell in with them, and not too soon, for all were thoroughly exhausted. They had abandoned everything, and when the doctor arrived were without food. 4 of them, who were accommodated on the sledge, were broken down with scurvy, and 2 others had been attacked slightly. What was to be done in this critical position of affairs? At first it was thought advisable to remain on the spot for a while and see if the Eskimos could shoot a seal, but a day's experience showed that this plan would not answer, and they then resolved to carry the 2 worst invalids on the dog sledge to Hall's Rest. This was accomplished, and the poor fellows seemed to grow better when nourished by seal soup and proper food, but on the following morning one of them sank and died. The life of the other hung for some time in the balance. The whole company were now invalided, and Hall's Rest might fitly have been termed Hall's Hospital. A few days, weary, melancholy days, having elapsed, an officer, with a couple of men, was sent across to the ship to report the serious condition of affairs. As it was the end of June, the ice had broken up in many places, and the traject of the strait was not accomplished without difficulty and frequent immersions in the water. No sooner did Captain Stephenson learn how the party were situated than he set out, with 7 men, to carry a supply of medicines, provisions, and various comforts. They had with them a boat and a sledge on a 4-wheeled car, and in this they crossed the land to the margin of the sea, a distance of about 6 miles. Sometimes the boat was called into requisition to carry themselves and the sledge from floe to floe. With half of the men they returned in a few days, leaving the rest in charge of Lieutenant Beaumont and Dr. Koppinger, until they had made more progress towards recovery. Early in August, an officer arrived from the Alert to report that she had moved southward and was only about 10 miles distant, and that Captain Nares, considering the main objects of the expedition secured, had decided on returning to England. About the same time returned the North Greenland party, their provisions having failed them. A few days later, and having made her way through the broken ice, the Alert joined the Discovery in Discovery Bay. Mr. Beaumont's party next arrived, and both vessels prepared for the homeward voyage. They left Discovery Bay, as we shall see, on the 28th of August. Let us now return to the Alert, which we left embedded in the ice of the North Polar Ocean. Her crew made shift to spend a tolerably merry winter, availing themselves of the usual resources of Arctic explorers under similar conditions. The day's order was much as follows. At 6 a.m., the commander was called, and all hands were piped up on deck, and the hammocks having been previously stowed away and the decks cleansed, everybody sat down, with vigorous appetite, to breakfast. The steerage and lower deck were afterwards cleared up, and soon after 9 a.m. the men were told off for their respective daily duties. At 10 a.m. another general parade of the crew was summoned, and as a preventive against scurvy, the day's dose of 324 lime juice was administered. Then the crew went to quarters, the usual careful inspection took place, and the chaplain read prayers. At 1 o'clock the deck was cleared, and dinner smoked upon the board. On days when the darkness was not too intense, the crew turned out to work upon the ice, or took their turn at walking exercise and amusements. They were thus occupied until supper, which was served at about 5 o'clock, and followed by evening school, the the duties of which proved equally agreeable to the officers who taught and the men who learned. Soon after 9, the officers in charge inspected the ship to see that all was quiet for the night. At 10 out went the lights of the chief petty officers, and at 11 those of the wardroom. This daily routine was freely interrupted on festival occasions. Guy Fawkes' Day was celebrated as hilariously as by the men of the Discovery, and it is a curious illustration of the strength of Old English traditions that the merry-making customs of the 5th of November should be thus closely observed by both the icebound vessels. Due honors were also paid to Father Christmas, nor was New Year's Day forgotten. Dramatic talent existed among the men of the Alert in sufficient force to provide a regular dramatic company. The Royal Arctic Theatre was erected in Funnel Row, and entertainments given weekly. The programs of the Thursday Pops, as they were commonly called, were thrown off at a printing press established in Trap Lane by Messrs. Gifford and Simmons, and from one of these we gather that the Royal Arctic Theatre opened for the season under the distinguished patronage of Captain Nares, the members of the Arctic Expedition, and all the nobility and gentry of the neighborhood, on the 18th of November 1875. The orchestra consisted of one eminent pianist, Signor Aldrichi, Lieutenant Aldrich, and the scenic artist was Dr. Moss. The performances commenced at 7, and sledges might be ordered at 9 o'clock. They were by no means wholly dramatic. The bill of fare included scientific and historical lectures, readings and recitations, songs and instrumental music, ranging from grave to gay, from lively to severe, and now and then, to draw a bumper house, some such attraction as feats of legerdemain by the real Wizard of the North, on his way to the Hyperborean regions, acrobatic feats by the bounding brothers of the frigid zone, or the vocal performances of the Palo Christi minstrels, who never sing in London. The plays produced were an original burlesque operetta, The Vulgar Little Boy, or Weeping Bill, founded on Barham's popular Misadventures at Margate, written expressly by the ship's chaplain, the Rev. W. H. Pullen, author of the well-known political squib, Dame Europa's School, Aladdin, or The Wonderful Scamp, Boots at the Swan, and the Area Bell. The last and grand night was March 2, 1876, when Captain Nares lectured on the Palacristic Sea and sledging experiences, and after a variety of songs and readings, the company and audience sang a grand choral strain, the Palacristic Chorus, which we borrow from the pages of the graphic. Not very long ago, on the 6-foot flow of the Palacristic Sea, 2 ships did ride, mid the crushing of the tide, the Alert and the Discovery. The sun never shone their gallant crews upon, for 142 days, 325, but no darkness and no hummocks their merry hearts could flummox. So they set to work and acted plays. There was music and song to help the hours along, brought forth from the good ship's store, and each man did his best to amuse and cheer the rest. And nobody can't do more. Here's a health to Marco Polo. May he reach his northern goal, and advance the flag of England into realms unknown. May the challenger be there, all courses bold to dare, and Victoria be victorious in the frozen zone. May our Poppy be in sight, with her colors streaming bright, and the Bulldog tug on merrily from strand to strand, and the Alexandra brave see our banner proudly wave o'er the highest cliffs and summits of the northernmost land. Here's a health to Hercules, whom the autumn blast did freeze, and all our gallant fellows by the frost laid low. Just wait a little longer, till they get a trifle stronger, and they'll never pull the worse for having lost a toe. Here's a health with 3 times 3 to the brave Discovery, and our merry, merry guests so truly welcome here, and a brimming bumper yet to our gallant little pet, the lively Clements Markham with its bold charioteer. Here's a health to all true blue, to the officers and crew, who man this expedition neat and handy and may they ever prove, both in sledging and in love, that the tars of old Britannia are the dandy In explanation of some passages in the foregoing spirited effusion, we may state that the 6 sledges belonging to the Alert were named respectively Marco Polo, Victoria, Challenger, Poppy, Bulldog, and Alexandra. Hercules appears to have been the nickname of one of the strong men of the ship. The Alert wintered so far north that its officers and men failed to meet with some of the usual accessories of a polar expedition. There were no polar bears, no Eskimos, even auroral displays were infrequent. On the other hand, the darkness is described as not having been particularly dense. The reflection of the snow and the keen light of stars considerably mitigated the deep obscure, and once in every 14 days, the splendor of the moon illuminated the weird outlines of the monotonous Arctic scenery. Some sledging was done in the autumn, though spring is the season when it can best be undertaken. The Alert was no sooner made all snug in her winter quarters than sledging parties 326 carried provisions and boats along the shore both northward and westward, ready for use by expeditions in the following spring. The depot being planted within a mile of the farthest northern position hitherto attained by civilized man. After a terrible journey of 20 days' duration, the travelers returned on the 14th of October, just 2 days after the disappearance of the sun. The snow fell heavily, and by protecting the sloppy ice from the intense frost, rendered traveling difficult. The men's shoes got thoroughly wet, hence several were frostbitten, and one officer and 2 men, on their return, were compelled to undergo amputation. Beneath the cliffs lay great dense, deep snow wreaths, and in many places a road had to be excavated to the depth of 6 feet. The men sunk to their waists. The sledge was often completely buried. It needed all Lieutenant Rawson's resolution and patience to bring back his little company in safety. The main sledging party, under Commander Markham, with Lieutenants Parr and May and 25 men, left the Alert on the 25th of September for the purpose of establishing a depot at Cape Joseph Henry. They advanced 3 miles beyond Sir Edward Parry's northernmost point, and from a mountain 2,000 feet high, sighted land towards the west-northwest, as far as lat. 8037 N, but saw none to the northward. With the return of the sun on the 29th of February, Captain Nares began his preparations for the spring sledging expeditions, organizing 2 main detachments. One, bound northward, under Commander Markham and Lieutenant Parr, with 15 men, supported by Dr. Moss and Mr. White, with 2 7-man sledges, and another, bound westward, consisting of 2 7-man sledges, led by Lieutenants Aldrich and Gifford. On the 12th of March, Lieutenant Rawson and Mr. Edgerton, as already narrated, started off to open up communication with the Discovery, but were compelled to return by the illness of Peterson, whom they nursed on the way with womanlike tenderness and devotion. In the following week, accompanied by Simmons of the Alert and Regan of the Discovery, they resumed their adventurous track across the hummocky ice, with the temperature 40 below zero, enduring much, but pushing forward undauntedly. When their comrades of the Discovery condoled with them on account of frostbitten cheeks, and noses, and fingers, it was with the frank, blithe heroism of the true British seaman that Lieutenant Rawson replied, "Well, at least we feel that the cheers from Southsea Beach have been fairly earned." The sledging expeditions began in earnest in the first week of April, only a few men being left on board each ship. Captain Stephenson, of the Discovery, paid a visit to the Alert, and also crossed Hall's Basin twice to Greenland. Captain Nares with Captain Faildon was not less energetic, and for a considerable area round the 2 ships all was activity and motion. When at Polaris Bay, Captain Stephenson, in memory of the gallant and unfortunate Hall, hoisted the American ensign and erected a brass tablet above the explorer's lonely grave. It bears the following inscription: "Sacred to the memory of Captain C.F. Hall, of the U.S. ship Polaris, who sacrificed his life in the advancement of science on November 8, 1871. This tablet has been erected by the British Polar Expedition of 1875, who, following in his footsteps, have profited by his experience." It may be noted here, in illustration of the labor attendant on the equipment of an Arctic 327 sledge party, and the dispatch of provisions for their sustenance, that, in order to support the expeditions on the north coast of Greenland and in Petermann Fjord, Robeson Channel was crossed 11 times from the position of the Alert to a depot established north of Cape Brevoort, and Hall's Basin 11 times between Discovery Bay and Polaris Bay, making a total of 22 sledge parties crossing the straits, including the transporting of 2 boats. The main depot at Cape Joseph Henry, for the support of the northern and western divisions, 37 miles from the Alert, was visited by 16 different sledges. Our travelers did not fail to examine the various cairns erected by the seamen of the Polaris. At one place, a box chronometer was found to be in excellent order, though it had undergone the test of 4 Arctic winters, and some wheat, which the Polaris had brought out in order to ascertain the effect upon it of exposure to extreme cold, was successfully cultivated under a glass shade by Dr. Ninnies, almost as interesting an experiment in its way as the sowing and successful harvesting of mummy wheat, the grains found in ancient Egyptian sepulchres. The British expedition had advanced so far north that it was beyond the life limit of bears, birds, and even seals, and the sledging parties, unable therefore to obtain any fresh game, were severely attacked by scurvy. This fell disease invariably broke out when its victims were farthest from any assistance. The journeys back to the ships were consequently undertaken, as we have already pointed out, by men whose strength decreased daily, and the burden became all the greater as man after man was smitten down, and to save his life placed upon the sledge. Great was the alarm on board the Alert when, towards the close of the 8th of June, Lieutenant Parr suddenly presented himself. He was alone. Where were his comrades? What calamity had befallen them? He soon explained that he had undertaken a journey of 35 miles, toiling for 22 hours through mist and drift and snow, and guided only by the fresh track of a stray wolf, to convey the news of the prostrated condition of the members of the northern expedition. Preparations were immediately made for hastening to their assistance. With the help of the officers, who all volunteered to drag the sledges, Captain Nares was able by midnight to start with 2 strong relief parties, Messrs. Edgerton, Canibert, Wooten, and White, the officers who could best be spared from the ship, taking their places at the drag ropes, and Lieutenant May and Dr. Moss pushing forward with a supply of medicines in the dog sledge. Such was the alacrity and energy of the 2 latter, that they contrived to reach Commander Markham's encampment within 50 hours of the departure of Lieutenant Parr, though, unfortunately, not in time to save the life of one of the Marines, who but a few hours before had expired and been buried in the floe. On the remainder of the stricken company, their arrival, however, had a most beneficial influence, and when, early the next day, Captain Nares came up to their relief, their courage and resolution, which had never deserted them, were quickened to the utmost, and even the invalids threw off that dread depression an attack of scurvy invariably produces. On the morning of the 14th, all were once more safe on board the ship, and offering up their heartfelt thanksgiving to God. Captain Nares furnishes some particulars which illustrate very vividly the terrible experiences of the adventurous sledge party, and also the ravages which scurvy never fails to commit. He says that of the 17 officers and men who originally left the Alert, only 5, namely, 3 officers and 2 men, were able to drag the sledges alongside. 3 others, heroes as true as any of those whom Homer has made famous, manfully kept on their feet to 3:28 the last, enduring the extreme of pain and fatigue rather than, by riding on the sledges, increase the burden their weakened companions had to drag. They were just able to crawl on board ship without assistance. The remaining 8 had struggled gallantly, but the disease had proved too much for them, and they were carried on the sledges. Out of the whole number, only 2 officers escaped the ravages of scurvy. After due rest and medical attention, the chief carpenter's mate returned to his duty, and 3 others recovered so as to be able to wait on their sick comrades. But Jolliffe, a petty officer, who had nobly borne up against the disease while actively employed, when his legs became cramped from resting on board, proved to be one of the most lingering cases. Surely the nation will never begrudge the cost of expeditions, which give such occasion for the display of the most generous unselfishness and the noblest devotion. These sledge journeys were performed in the face of tremendous difficulties. Beyond the mere coast belt, there was little smooth ice. The tolerably level floes or fields, usually about 6 feet above the neighboring ice, seldom measured a mile across. Their surfaces were thickly covered with rounded blue-topped ice humps, averaging 20 feet high, which lay sometimes in ranges, and sometimes 100 to 200 yards apart, the intervening spaces being filled with wind-driven snow, and the whole resembling a gusty ocean suddenly stiffened into rest. 12 between these floes, like an embankment of rude formation, extended a vast pile of the wreck and refuse of previous summers, broken up pack ice, regulated during the winter into one rugged and confused mass of angular blocks of various heights up to 40 and 50 feet, and of every imaginable variety of configuration, like the disrupted lava at the mouth of a crater. These were interspersed with a continuous series of steep-sided snowdrifts, which stretched downwards from the highest summit of the ice chaos until lost in the general level at a distance of about 100 yards. It may be conceived that it was not easy to find a passage for the sledges through these labyrinths of ice and snow. The snow slopes were by no means an assistance, for the winter winds coming chiefly from the west, and the course of the sledges being due north, they had to be encountered almost at right angles. Consequently, the journey was an incessant struggle with ever-recurring obstacles. As fast as one had been conquered, another presented itself. The pickaxes were in constant requisition, either to cut a way through the packed-up ice or out of the perpendicular side of the high floes. Instead of a steady advance, the whole party were frequently detained half a day by the necessity of facing the sledge and hauling it forward a few feet at a time. These considerations will enable the reader to judge how great must have been the pluck, persistence, and energy which could accomplish a journey of 70 miles in such exceptional circumstances. Captain Nares observes, and his eulogium will be endorsed by the reader, that no two officers could have accomplished this laborious enterprise with greater ability or courage than Commander Markham and Lieutenant Parr. And it is but just that the services of Rawlings and Lawrence, the captains of the two sledges, should be put on record. In addition to their general cheerfulness and good humor, qualities which always help to lighten difficult work, to their care and skill were due the safe return of the sledges, on which the lives of all depended, safe, uninjured, and in as serviceable a state as when they left the ship, notwithstanding the terrible character of the road they had traveled. To such men as these, and to the brave 329 patient, resolute sledge crews generally, we owe the tribute of our praise. However severe their privations, they never complained. During this memorable journey to penetrate to the north over the rugged polar oceanic ice, a journey in which the pluck and determination of the British seamen were most conspicuously displayed, day after day, against obstacles which might well have been regarded as insurmountable, the two officers and their brave followers succeeded in advancing the Union Jack to latitude 83°26 N, or within 400 miles of the North Pole. In order to attain this advanced post, the present boundary mark of geographical research in that direction, the total distance traveled was 276 miles on the outward, and 245 miles on the homeward journey, though the farthest direct distance from the ship did not exceed 73 miles. The result of labor so colossal and sufferings so severe would seem to be that we must consider a long journey over the polar pack ice, with sledge and boat, to be impracticable at any season of the year. As the sledges were necessarily advanced each stage singly, we are able to calculate the exact rate of progression which may be expected, if it should be thought desirable to push forward with light sledges, without any additional means of returning later in the season in the event of a disruption of ice in the rear. The maximum attained by Commander Markham was 2¾ miles a day, the mean rate being 1 mile and a quarter. The outbreak of scurvy rendered Captain Nares very anxious as to the welfare of Lieutenant Aldrich's company on their return from the westward, and the more so when it was found that the cairn erected over his depot of provisions, 30 miles to the northwest, remained untouched on the day appointed for his arrival there. Lieutenant May, with the dog sledge, and 3 robust men, were therefore sent to meet him. On the 20th of June the two parties met at the depot and signaled the welcome fact to Captain Nares. It was fortunate that Lieutenant Aldrich returned when he did, for on the following day a rapid thaw set in, with the wind from the southward, and the snow valleys were rendered impassable for sledges for the rest of the season. His party, like Commander Markham's, were stricken with scurvy, 4 of them lying helpless on the dog sledge, and Lieutenant May's arrival proved most opportune. Having now assembled all his company on board the Alert, Captain Nares was called upon to decide whether it was possible to carry the work of exploration further, or whether the expedition should return to England. Owing to the absence of any land with a northward trend, and the innavigable character of the polar pack ice, he concluded that on neither side of Smith Sound could any ship advance further northward than the Alert had done, and also that from no secure position in Smith Sound was it possible for sledges to advance nearer to the pole. If the expedition remained in the vicinity for another season, the exploration of the shores of Grant Land might be pursued to the southwest, and of Greenland to the northeast, but not more than 50 miles beyond the points already attained. In the weakened condition of the crew, and for so small an additional gain, Captain Nares decided that it would be unwise to risk another winter. As soon as the ice broke up, ho for merry England. A regular thaw did not set in until the last week of June. Water flowed in the ravines on 3:30 the 1st of July. After that date, the thaw gradually extended, and increased in rapidity, and on the 23rd, a strong southwest wind drove the pack a mile away from the shore. On the 26th, a cairn was erected on the shore, and a record of the work of the expedition deposited in it. And on the 31st, a passage having been cleared through the winter barrier of icebergs, the Alert, with a strong southwest wind filling her canvas, pushed out into Robeson Channel on her homeward voyage. After a run of 2 miles alongshore, through a fairly open way between the pack ice and what Dr. Kane calls the ice foot, she was checked in her course by a heavy floe 1.5 miles in diameter, which almost touched the land, and no other shelter being available, she lay up in a small cove or creek, among a group of icebergs that had gone ashore in the shallows. The obstructive floe showed signs of movement early on the morning of August 1st, and soon afterwards went away to the northward at the rate of 1.5 miles an hour, grinding along the ice foot somewhat alarmingly as it advanced towards the ship. Steam being up, however, the Alert cast off her moorings, and succeeded in edging between the land and the floe, while the latter swung round inshore with a violent jerk, close to the position which the ship had previously occupied. We may note here the difference which Captain Nares insists upon between an ordinary floe, such as is commonly met with in Arctic waters, and the ancient polar sea ice. The former seldom exceeds 6 feet in thickness, and breaks into fragments against an obstruction, or may be charged by a steamship. But the latter, being some 80 or 100 feet thick, lifts all impediments out of its course, or, so to speak, throws them disdainfully away. Such was the case on this occasion. The polar floe, which, says Captain Nares, we only escaped by a few yards, on nipping against the heavy breastwork of isolated floebergs lining the coast, some of them 40 feet high and many thousand tons in weight, which had lately formed our protection from the smaller ice pieces, tilted them over one after another, and forced them higher up the landslope, like a giant at play, without receiving the slightest harm itself, not a piece breaking away. It was most providential that, by its twisting round, the Alert was enabled to escape out of the trap in which she was enclosed. The shore here presented a formidable line of ice cliff, from 20 to 40 feet in height, striking down into clear blue water 10 to 20 fathoms deep. The Alert kept onward, so close to the cliff that the boats hung at her quarter frequently touched it, until again brought to a stop near Cape Union by the accumulation of the pack. Her captain, however, was able here to secure her abreast of a large stream, the current of which had undermined the ice cliff for some 50 yards, and floated it off to sea, leaving a kind of cove or harbor where the ship could be laid alongside the beach in such a manner that, if the pack struck her, it could only force her on shore. The reader of Arctic voyages will remember that a somewhat similar position was once occupied by Sir Edward Parry's ship, under somewhat similar circumstances. When the tide had turned and began to flow southward, it broke up the ice all around Cape Union and formed a narrow waterway, which offered Captain Nares a chance of escape. Steam was got up immediately, but owing to unavoidable delay in shipping the rudder, the ice closed in before the ship could be carried round. Her last stage was worse than her first, for she was now cut off from her safe little port, and no better shelter was available than a slight hollow or break in the ice cliff. Here, however, she was brought to, with the ice blocks swirling past her at a distance of 20 yards. At low water Captain Nares cast off, and bored some 331 way into the pack, so that the Alert might drift round the cape with the southern tide. At about 1/4 mile from the land, she drove along with the ice, and when the tide slackened, steamed out of the pack before it began to set to the northward. Then, keeping close in to the ice foot, she kept slowly on her course to the southward, the waterway broadening as she approached Lincoln Bay, which was crossed without difficulty. When within 5 miles of Cape Beechey, the tide turned, but after a short delay a channel opened, allowing the ship to round the cape. At this point the ice cliff ends, and the land slopes gently to the shore, which is protected by a barrier of floebergs, similar to but smaller than those which line the shore of the polar sea. Here the ship was made fast in 3 fathoms water, within 20 yards of the shore, about a mile to the south of the cape. We dwell on these particulars in order that our readers may form some idea of the difficulties of Arctic voyaging. The words, "she forced her way through the ice," afford no conception whatever of the obstacles that have to be overcome, and the dangers that have to be avoided, by a ship navigating in the midst of pack ice and ice floes, or of the skill and vigilance and patience on the part of officers and men, by which only can the enterprise be brought to a successful issue. We are told that on August the 4th snow squalls blew from the southwest. As the ice had closed in around the ship, holding it in a vice, the sportsmen of the party landed and visited some neighboring lakes in search of game. They found a number of wild geese and killed 57, which supplied a welcome addition to the ordinary bill of fare. Mr. Edgerton and a seaman were sent off to the Discovery, then about 20 miles distant, with orders for her to prepare for the homeward voyage. We have already related how they reached the ship in safety. While the Alert was thus imprisoned, the huge pack ice in the offing was carried up and down the strait by the tidal movement, the wind having the effect of increasing the velocity of the current and the duration of its flow both northward and southward. The ice generally was of a lighter character than that in the polar sea, but many heavy polar flows were driven southward by the gale and set into Lady Franklin Sound and Archer Fjord rather than down Kennedy Channel. Lady Franklin Sound, indeed, seems to be the receptacle of all the heavy ice that comes south through Robeson Channel, retaining it until the prevailing westerly winds carry it once more to the northward and empty the sound, previous to its being refilled on the return of the northerly gales. It is only, says Captain Nares, in seasons when northerly winds occur more frequently than westerly ones, that any considerable quantities of the huge polar ice are drifted into Smith Sound and Baffin Bay. The gale of the 6th of August was very violent. The tide rushing southward drove a succession of heavy floe pieces against the small bergs that protected the ship and capsized one of them completely. It was firmly aground when struck by the point of a large floe, but such was the force of the collision that it was reared erect in the air to its full height of at least 60 feet above water, when, turning a complete somersault like a practiced gymnast, it came down on its back with a shock that shattered it into pieces and raised a wave sufficient to roll the ship considerably. Into the gap thus caused moved the ice, until at last it nipped the Alert, though not dangerously. That same evening, Lieutenant Rawson and 2 seamen arrived from the Discovery, with news of the ill fortune that had overtaken the Greenland sledge party. It soon became apparent that there was no chance of releasing the icebound ship except by cutting down the heavy floe that held her prisoner, and accordingly all hands were set to work. After 3 days' toil, so much of the floe was hewn away that at high water it floated and set the ship free. At the same time the main pack moved off, and the Alert steamed onward, rejoining her consort, the Discovery, on the 11th of August. All the invalids on board the Alert were now removed to the Discovery, and Captain Nares remained at the entrance to the harbor, prepared to cross to Polaris Bay, as soon as the ice permitted, to relieve Lieutenant Beaumont. As before stated, however, he arrived on the 14th, and relieved the commander of the expedition of a serious anxiety. Both vessels were now ready to start, but the state of the ice detained them until the 20th, when, a lead offering through the pack, away they steamed, and arrived close to Cape Lawrence without encountering any serious obstacle. Here their old enemy, the ice, again opposed them, and Captain Nares found only the famous 3 courses of a well-known statesman open to him, either to return north, to drive ahead into the pack, or make fast the ships to some of the grounded floebergs. This last expedient was adopted, and in a landlocked inner basin the Alert and the Discovery were accordingly secured. But unfortunately, at the fall of high water a piece of ice pressed against the Alert, and at the same time its protecting floeberg drove ashore. Result: the Alert was aground forward, but with deep water under the stern, and before she could be released, the tide had fallen 14 feet, so that the ship lay over at an angle of 22, with forefoot and keel exposed as far aft as the fore channels. Nothing could be done until the tide rose. Then the ship was lightened, and afterwards hauled off without having undergone any damage. A passage again opened on the 22nd of August, and the 2 ships steamed as far southward as Cape Collinson, with no other troubles than dense snowstorms, mists, and strong headwinds. But off the Cape, the Alert having to back to escape a nip, she fouled the Discovery for a moment, the latter escaping, however, with nothing worse than the loss of a boat's davit. The ice gradually breaking up before a strong southwest wind, the 2 ships crossed Scoresby Bay, which was perfectly clear, but rolled with a heavy sea. As they approached Cape Fraser, they were buffeted by a terrible gale, and put into Morey Bay, anchoring among a quantity of grounded ice. 3 days were spent in arduous efforts to double Cape Fraser, one of the bêtes noires of Arctic navigators, because it is the meeting point of the flood tides, north and south, one from the polar ocean and the other from the Atlantic, and Cape Hayes, the boundary mark of the channel. Then the voyagers, with glad hearts, passed into Smith Sound, and hugging the shore as closely as was safe, arrived on the 29th at Prince Imperial Island in Dobbin Bay, everyone heartily thankful to be out of the pack, clear of the straggling icebergs, and for the ships to be secured to fixed ice once more. The temperature now sunk again below freezing point. The brief Arctic summer was over, and day and night the young sea ice formed continuously. The mists that had hitherto accompanied the ships cleared away before a brisk northerly wind, and revealed a magnificent panorama of lofty mountains, white with shrouds of snow, and deep valleys filled with colossal glaciers. One of these stretched downwards to the shore, and threw off great icebergs which floated or stranded in Dobbin Bay. It was named after the Empress Eugenie, who had taken a lively personal interest in the expedition. Crossing Dobbin Bay on the 1st of September, the voyagers came within a quarter of a mile of a depot of provisions established near Cape Hawkes in the previous autumn, and succeeded in removing a portion. A day or two later Captain Nares landed on Washington Island and visited a cairn which he had raised there on the 12th of August 1865. He visited, also, two old cairns erected by former explorers. The lichens with which they were gray proved that they were of earlier date than Dr. Hayes' expedition. On the 3rd of September, by dint of steaming assiduously, the ships rammed their way through a lane of water to the westward of Cape Hawkes, which was inconveniently obstructed by loose pieces of old ice. After rounding the cape, says the captain, the pack by drifting away from the land had left unfrozen water and numerous detached small floes, which forced them to make a very serpentine course, and occasionally to pass within 30 yards of the low ice foot on the shore, fortunately always finding deep water. In this way they reached Allman Bay, halfway between Cape Hawkes and Franklin Pierce Bay. Meeting here with a belt of new ice, the Discovery was sent ahead, and under full steam she forced a canal through the ice, which was from 1 to 3 inches thick. From the lofty hills in the interior, a huge glacier leads down to Allman Bay, and it is a noticeable fact that always in the neighborhood of a glacier stream the water was found nearly fresh, and of the temperature of 32. On the 7th, our homeward-bound ships reached Norman Locker Island, on the margin of Princess Marie Bay. The season was now far advanced, and as the slightest mistake might have led to the vessels being icebound for the winter, the two captains ascended to the highest point of the island to obtain some idea of the prospect before them. They were much relieved by seeing a large area of open water some 20 miles distant, which they conjectured would extend to the mouth of Smith Sound. No time was lost in getting under way, and the ships crossed 2/3 of the distance before they fell in with ice. By charging it under full steam, they cleared the obstacle, and then, through an open water channel, ran on to Cape Sabine. On the 9th of September they arrived off Cape Isabella, where they found a small packet of letters and newspapers which had been left at the depot by the Pandora. The weather was now calm, and the wind favorable. Sail was hoisted therefore, as the supply of coal began to run short, and on the evening of the 12th the expedition reached Barden Bay. During the 13th and the 14th they worked southward into Wolstenholme Sound, and thence, with a southeasterly wind, crossed to Cape Byam Martin, which they reached on the 16th. 2 days later they entered the well-known waters of Melville Bay. On the 25th they arrived at Disco, where and afterwards at Edgedesmond they obtained some small supplies of coal. Edgedesmond was left behind on the 2nd of October, and on the 4th the two ships recrossed the Arctic Circle, exactly 15 months from the time of crossing it on the outward voyage. Experiencing adverse winds, they made but slow progress to the southward, and as the weather became warmer and damper, a few of the men suffered from rheumatism and catarrhs. During a heavy gale on the 19th, the two ships separated, but both, as we have seen, reached the shores of England in safety, where their gallant officers and crews met with the hearty welcome so thoroughly merited by their courage, perseverance, and heroic industry. Some notes on the general results obtained by the expedition in zoology, botany, and geology have appeared in the Academy. The two naturalists under whose care these departments 334 were placed, Captain Faildon, in the Alert, and Mr. Hart, in the Discovery, worked with unflagging energy and no small success. Of mammals, the species found farthest north were the Arctic fox, the wolf, the ermine, the polar hare, the lemming, and the muskox, all of which were seen on the shores of the Great Polar Basin or Polycrystic Sea. No cetaceans were sighted north of Payer Harbor, near Cape Sabine, a fact which renders all the more serious the gradual process of extermination of the Greenland, or right whale in more southern latitudes. The only seal found beyond Cape Union, in lat. 8215 N, was the little ringed seal or flowrat, Phoca hispida. So far as the land extended, bird life prevailed, the species being the snowy owl, the snow bunting, and the ptarmigan. Full collections were made of all the birds frequenting Smith Sound, and our naturalists had the satisfaction of discovering the long-sought-for breeding haunts of the knot and sanderling 13. Few species of marine fish were obtained, but an interesting small salmonoid was met with in freshwater lakes as far north as lat. 8235. A fine collection of marine invertebrates was secured by dredging and trawling, and the character of the sea bottom from Baffin Bay up to lat. 8319. N was accurately ascertained by a series of careful soundings. In the Department of Botany, our naturalists were rewarded by the discovery of between 20 and 30 species of phanerogamic plants between the parallels of 82 and 83. Much richer and more varied results were obtained in the cryptogamic flora. Geologically, the facts arrived at were of the utmost value. The whole west coast of Smith Sound, from Cape Isabella to Cape Union, has been fully surveyed and mapped, and large collections have been made both of fossils and rock specimens, while the sledge parties which explored the shore of the polar basin, both to east and west, brought back sufficient material to determine the geological character of the country. Silurian limestones, richly fossiliferous, were the prevailing rocks along Smith Sound. Miocene deposits, including a 20-foot seam of coal, were found as far north as lat. 8144. From the shales and sandstones of this formation, a beautiful series of leaf impressions were collected, illustrating the characteristic flora of the epoch, and presenting a remarkable demonstration of the existence of a temperate climate within 500 miles of the present pole at a comparatively recent geological time. Not less important are the indications of great recent changes in the elevation of the land afforded by the discovery of thick post-Pliocene deposits, lying at a considerable elevation above the sea level, and containing fossils similar to the existing marine fauna. Lastly, very interesting and suggestive observations have been made on glaciation and ice action in general. This, of course, is but a summary, and a very brief and condensed one, of researches which have evidently been of the highest importance. And it might almost be said of the late expedition that even had its geographical discoveries been less valuable, its scientific results would have entitled it to a foremost place in the annals of Arctic enterprise. Our record of Arctic expeditions will fitly close with a sketch of the cruise of the Pandora, a screw yacht commanded by Captain Allen Young, which left England in the summer of 1876 in order to open up communications with the Admiralty expedition. Chart showing the discoveries of the British Polar Expedition 1875-76. From map accompanying official report published in Nature. Captain Young left Upernavik on the evening of the 19th of July and stood away to the northward in bad weather and with the wind blowing a gale. Through vast fields of ice he threaded his way, sometimes under sail, sometimes under steam, until on the morning of the 24th he found his ship completely surrounded in lat. 7510 N. No time was lost in endeavoring to effect an escape by charging the ice at full speed, again and again returning to the onset, and a slow but steady progress was being made, when the field in which they were held fast, drifting before the gale, collided with a group of grounded bergs and exposed the little vessel to such severe pressure that preparations were made for abandoning her. Provisions, ammunition, camping, and traveling gear, all were made ready, and the boats were lowered as far as possible at the davits. Meantime, heavy charges of gunpowder were used to blast the ice where it pressed the ship most severely, and the bergs taking a different direction, the Pandora began to recover herself, and before night settled down nearly to her usual level. In the darkness of the night, with the wind howling, and the snow and sleet driving in heavy showers, she moved ahead with the pack, and in this way continued her progress until the 27th, when the weather cleared, and Captain Young discovered that he had advanced right into the heart of Melville Bay, with no water in sight. Full in view were Capes Walker and Melville, the peaked hill, and huge glacier streams embedded in the intervening valleys. All around was one vast monotonous sheet of rugged ice. It was not until the 29th that the Pandora, after many hairbreadth escapes, got into open water in lat. 7550 N and long. 6455 W. While thus imprisoned in the grasp of the floe, the explorers killed only one polar bear, 4 seals, and a few little auks. In a clear sea they now stood away to the westward, passing Capes Dudley, Digges, and Athol, and other headlands familiar in the records of Arctic adventure. At noon on the 31st, when off Wolstenholme Island, another gale overtook them, increasing rapidly to almost hurricane fury. This was an unpleasant experience, for the deck was washed by heavy seas, and it was with the greatest difficulty they avoided coming into collision with the icebergs which drifted rapidly through the snow and spray. Reaching Carey Island, they landed to examine Captain Nary's depot of provisions, and found it in good preservation. The cairn had not been visited since Young's call at the island on the 10th of September in the previous year. Afterwards they made for Sutherland Island, where they found a record of the American explorer, Captain Hartstein, dated August 16, 1855. It is with a curious feeling that, in these regions of almost perpetual winter, the voyager comes upon such faint memorials of men who, like him, have dared all the perils of ice floes and icebergs, and adventured into seas far beyond the track of ordinary commercial enterprise. On Littleton Island, a record of the expedition was found. The document was dated July 28, 1875, and signed by Captain Nares, and it indicated the course about to be taken by the ships under his orders. Owing to the ice-encumbered condition of the straits, however, Captain Young could not follow it up, and instead of crossing to Cape Isabella, he resolved to examine the coast in Hartstein Bay, in order to seek a harbor for the relief ship which the Admiralty had intended to send out in 1877, in case of the non-return of the polar expedition. This was found on the 4th of August, not far from the Eskimo settlement of Etta, and named after the Pandora. It would seem to offer every advantage as winter quarters for Arctic discovery ships. The surrounding hills are dotted with Arctic hares, appearing like snowballs on the 336 luxurious vegetation. The little auk breeds in thousands on the cliffs, eider fowl and guillemots haunt the waters, and the adjacent valleys and pastures are frequented by reindeer. Captain Young next made for Cape Isabella, which he reached on the 6th of August. Watchful eyes soon discovered a large cairn on the summit of this headland. A boat was lowered, and the contents of the cairn soon obtained, while dispatches and letters for Captain Nary's expedition were left in their stead. Then the Pandora steamed to the northward, but owing to the adverse winds and the accumulated ice, could make no way and was forced back to Cape Isabella. Another attempt was made to the eastward, and for several days the gallant little ship crossed and recrossed the straits, through the pack, always beset with ice, and frequently enshrouded in impenetrable fogs. No fewer than 3 times was she compelled to take shelter in Pandora Harbor. On the 19th, she was driven back to the northward of Littleton Island, and Captain Young and some of his officers took the opportunity of visiting the Polaris camp. Nothing remained of the house erected by Captain Buddington except a few broken boards. The rocks were strewn with pieces of metal, fragments of clothing, and other waifs and strays. The cache in which the retreating party had deposited their books and instruments was also examined, but the only relics were a brass bowl of a 7-inch compass, a tin tube, and parts of a telescope. Some cases and casks, containing records for the use of Captain Nares, were securely placed among the rocks on the western point of the island, and Captain Young then returned to Cape Isabella. Finding nothing here of any interest, and convinced that no traveling or boat party had reached that position from the polar ships, the Pandora bore away to the northward under canvas. It was very dark and thick, says Captain Young, but sufficiently clear to enable us to avoid the heavy ice. By 9 a.m., we were up to Lecomte Island, when we were stopped by a fog until 11 o'clock, when I could see from aloft that the main pack extended across the straits into Ross Bay. We were in a lake of land water, with close-backed and heavy ice all round, from south to north, and again closing on the land from the eastward. Our only chance of moving seemed to be through a narrow lead or slack place, running first to the east-northeast, and then again apparently towards the east coast. We entered the pack, and succeeded by 5 p.m. and again escaping into the land water in Hartstein Bay. Such are the experiences of 12 hours in the ice-clogged waters of the north, but we need not delay the reader with these minute particulars, notwithstanding their interest, as illustrative of the nature of the struggle waged, with so much persistency of purpose, by the Arctic explorer. The sea was now covered everywhere with ice and bergs. Storms were of frequent occurrence, and the wind and wave-beaten Pandora was forced back into Baffin Bay. Here, on the 28th of August, her captain could see that the solid ice had filled the straits and the head of the bay right across to Cape Alexander. The way north being thus obstructed, Captain Young resolved on proceeding towards Upernavik, in North Greenland, hoping to find that the last ship had not already sailed for Denmark, and in that case to send an officer home with dispatches, while the Pandora returned to Smith Strait. On the 29th, she was off Hakluyt Island and steered for Barden Bay in Whale Sound. On entering the bay, a summer tent could be seen, and some Eskimos, with their dogs, running to and fro, evidently with the view of attracting the attention of the visitors. Captain Young accordingly landed with some of his officers and accompanied by Christian, his Eskimo 337 interpreter. The natives met them with the utmost confidence and fearlessness, assisting to haul their boat up on the shore. They were 10 in number, and all members of one family. Food appeared to be plentiful with them, but they were profuse in their thanks for some walrus flesh given by Captain Young. Their manners were frank and communicative, and they showed considerable vivacity, rejoicing over the results of a very good hunting season. Neither European ships nor white men had they seen for years, but they said that an old man, who, with his family, inhabited Northumberland Island, told of 2 ships which had passed to the northward last summer. How lonely must be the life led by these poor savages, never gladdened by the sight of a sail, but year after year shut up in their frozen solitudes, and without any other object or purpose before them than to obtain just enough food to avoid a premature and miserable death. Among their treasures, Captain Young observed a ship's bucket, half the top of a mahogany table, the paddle of a Greenlander's kayak, much ice-worn, and a piece of packing case marked lime juice Leith, all of which, they said, had drifted into the bay at different times from the southward. These people seemed to Captain Young of a kind and simple disposition, while they were evidently robust and healthy. All that they had, and it was little enough, they freely pressed upon their visitor, and when asked what present they would like, their chief selected only some gimlets and a 15-foot ash oar. The latter, he said, would split up into spear shafts, the former he wanted for boring bone and ivory. Captain Young, however, gave them several other useful articles, accepting in return some narwhal horns, specimens of their potstone cooking kettles, and of the iron pyrites which they used for striking fire. An exchange of dogs also took place, 5 of the dogs belonging to the Pandora being given for 3 of the finest bear-hunting and tame dogs of the Eskimos. At Upernavik, the Pandora, after a stormy and dangerous passage, arrived on the evening of September the 7th, but found that the last ship had sailed for Europe. As there were no means, therefore, of communicating with England, and as without such communication, Captain Young did not feel authorized to winter in the north, a supply of fresh water was taken on board, and the ship steered for home. From the 15th to the 21st she tarried at Goodhaven, in Disco Island. In Davis Strait she encountered large quantities of heavy Spitzbergen drift ice and weathered a severe southeasterly gale. On the 16th of October in lat. 5438 N and long. 4430 W, she sighted the Arctic ships, Alert and Discovery, and hastened to communicate with them. They kept together until the 19th. On the following day, the Pandora was buffeted by another hurricane, but the rest of her voyage was accomplished in safety and was marked by no incidents of importance. Here, for the present, terminates the record of British enterprise and adventure in the Arctic world. It is difficult to believe, however, that the nation will rest until the heart of the mystery has been plucked out, the secret finally mastered, and the British flag hoisted on that remote point which is conventionally known as the North Pole.